Hey there, curious minds. Tonight, we're diving deep into something that might just tickle your nose before it touches your thoughts. Picture this: you're wandering through the sun-baked alleys of Timbuktu, the light filtering down in golden slivers between mud brick walls, and the scent hits you first. Not dust, not rot, but a faint perfume, something floral with a hint of musk, as if history itself were wearing a little cologne. It clings to the air around old libraries, creeps out from under ancient wooden doors, and rests on the breath of a page turned slowly, reverently. You blink, sniff again, and wonder, did someone spill rose oil in the archives? But no, it's the manuscripts themselves. They smell like stories told through incense smoke and oil-slick fingers, like parchment kissed by petals. And yes, we're going there tonight. Into the world where books didn't just inform, they enchanted. They weren't cold slabs of ink. They were delicate, breathing things, wrapped in scent like a fine robe, ready to seduce the senses. You're about to explore a world where scholars paused before writing to light incense, where manuscripts were swaddled in fragrant cloth, and where the scent wasn't just pleasant, it was powerful. It was a kind of armor, a charm, and sometimes a secret code. And yes, the sad news is, you probably wouldn't survive long in the desert heat of 13th century Mali. Your phone would melt, your lips would crack, and don't even get me started on the lack of air conditioning. But at least you'd die surrounded by the smell of sandalwood and sacred ink, which is pretty classy, all things considered. Quick favor, before you dive into full-on relaxation mode, consider liking and subscribing. It helps more than you know, and I genuinely appreciate it if you do. If not, no worries, I'm just glad you're here. If you feel like sharing, drop your location and what time it is where you are. It's always magical to know who else is lying back, letting the night unfold right alongside you. Wherever you are, I'm glad you're here. Let's take a moment to leave the noise of the day behind. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You walk past low-slung buildings the color of toast, your fingers trailing along sun-warmed walls that feel like memory turned to clay. And then you step into one of the old libraries. Let's say the Ahmed Baba Institute, because why not name-drop a man who preserved tens of thousands of manuscripts while you forget your Wi-Fi password daily? The room is dim, cool, lined with aged wooden shelves sagging under the weight of knowledge. And that scent, it's soft, elusive, layered, like someone once spilled perfume 100 years ago, and it decided to stay. It's the smell of preservation, of human hands and rituals passed down through generations. But what's wild is, it's not an accident. Those books weren't stored in fragrant spaces by coincidence. In fact, some were deliberately anointed. Clove oil, rosewater, myrrh, sometimes even crushed citrus peels, all absorbed into the parchment or into the wooden covers over time. These weren't just texts, they were honored, sweetened, softened for spiritual and practical reasons alike. You reach out and pull a book gently from the shelf. It groans slightly in protest, or maybe that's just your imagination. The leather binding has softened, darkened with age. You open it and the smell deepens, earthy, resinous, with a whisper of spice. And it isn't just nostalgia tricking your brain. Modern researchers, who have dared to analyze these old documents using chemical tools, have actually confirmed the presence of trace botanical oils. And sure, some of it comes from the ingredients used in the ink or the parchment tanning process, but there's more. There's intention. These manuscripts were meant to be experienced, not just read. In some traditions, scent was thought to awaken divine focus or protect the sacredness of the text. Kind of like putting on your favorite hoodie before a deep conversation, except your hoodie smells like immortality and sandalwood. One story passed down from local scholars tells of a young apprentice who once sneezed near a Quranic page and was promptly smacked with a perfumed reed. Not because he sneezed, but because he didn't first inhale the fragrance of the page, which was considered part of the ritual. Historians still argue whether this practice was widespread or more of a regional embellishment. Timbuktu folklore has a way of adding spice to everything, including its own history. But what's undeniable is that these manuscripts were handled with reverence, bordering on the mystical. And scent was memory. Scent was sanctity. Picture this. It's the 1400s, and you're a scholar working by lamplight, your fingers stained with ink, your sandals dusty from the road. You've walked days to deliver this book, tucked in a leather satchel lined with pressed mint leaves to keep bugs away and pages soft. As you open it, you whisper a prayer, not for speed reading, but for clarity, wisdom, and perhaps even patience with marginalia. You gently fan the pages to let the scent rise and settle in the room like a spell. That perfume, it's not decoration, it's part of the book, part of its history, part of its breath. But let's be honest, you probably wouldn't recognize half the smells these manuscripts exhale. Some are ancient blends long lost to time. Some are regional flora no longer harvested in the same way. And others, well, they are the complicated leftovers of goat hide, human sweat, candle smoke, and 600-year-old ink. Still, something in them lingers, something sweet, ghostly, and just this side of familiar. And let's not forget the accidental aromatics. When a manuscript is stored in a chest lined with cedar bark and wrapped in cloth once perfumed for a wedding night, some of that scent seeps into the narrative. Scholars today argue about this too, how much of the fragrance is intentional and how much is accidental osmosis from generations of human touch and storage methods. But maybe that's part of the magic, like finding your grandmother's diary and catching a whiff of her old perfume. You don't ask why it's there. You just feel a little closer to her, and as you put the manuscript back, your fingers are reluctant. The scent clings. You've read nothing, and yet you've inhaled centuries. And whether the scent was layered purposefully or simply accumulated like moonlight on stone, what matters is it's there. Waiting, lingering, whispering. Like a story told in a language your nose almost remembers. You step back from the shelf, and your fingers still hum with the faint touch of centuries. The scent lingers in your skin, curling into your thoughts like a half-remembered dream. But the story doesn't pause there, it deepens. Because those manuscripts didn't just pick up perfume by accident. No, the act of writing in many medieval West African scriptoria, especially in centers like Timbuktu, Djenné, and Chingti, was itself a kind of ritual, often involving scent as both a sacred offering and a sensory anchor. You can almost hear the silence of a scriptorium now, broken only by the gentle scratch of reed pens against parchment and the soft hiss of incense in a clay burner tucked nearby. Smoke rises in delicate spirals. Not too thick, never choking, but enough to veil the room in an otherworldly hush. It wasn't just for atmosphere either. Frankincense, myrrh, and other sacred resins were believed to carry prayers, clear the air of distractions, and keep unwanted spirits, or maybe just aggressive mosquitoes, at bay. Historians still argue whether these rituals were grounded in religious orthodoxy, pre-Islamic traditions absorbed into Islamic scholarship, or just the creative quirks of bookish introverts trying to vibe in the desert. But what's clear is that scent was inseparable from scholarship. You didn't just write down divine words. You prepared for them, physically and mentally. You might wash your hands in rose water, light incense at your writing mat, and recite a few lines of Quran aloud before you dared put ink to skin. Yes, skin, because many of these manuscripts were written on vellum made from goat or sheepskin, specially tanned and treated to hold ink like memory holds dreams. Some scribes were even known to mix scented oils directly into their ink, not because it helped the writing, but because it honored the words. A formula might contain soot for pigment, gum arabic to bind, and just a drop of jasmine oil, enough to leave a trace when the ink dried. And this wasn't just about religion either. Even secular manuscripts, treatises on astronomy, medicine, ethics were sometimes written in scented environments. Because writing, in that time and place, wasn't a purely intellectual act. It was full body, full soul. You were embedding more than information, you were embedding mood, intent, even the breath of prayer. You didn't just copy the stars, you tried to smell the heavens while you did it. In some traditions, the entire act of transcribing was considered a devotional exercise, and you get why. Imagine spending 12 hours hunched over a text, writing by flickering lamp, while sandalwood burns slowly at your side, and outside the desert winds brush past like whispers. You don't just write the text, you become part of it. One Malian folk tale speaks of a young scribe who copied the same verse over and over until the scent of the ink wafted into his dreams, and he began reciting it in his sleep. His teacher took it as a sign that the manuscript was truly complete because the words had entered his bones. Now, sure, could that just be a sleep-deprived teenager hallucinating about Quranic grammar? Absolutely. But still, a poetic way to seal a book, don't you think? And sometimes, the ritual began even earlier. Before a scribe picked up a pen, he might prepare the space with burnt herbs and whispered invocations. Sage to purify, dried lavender to soothe, perhaps a blend of citrus peel and cinnamon if it was winter, and the chill snuck into the fingers like doubt. You light these things not because they help the grammar flow smoother, but because they mark the space as sacred. And don't pretend you haven't lit a candle before opening a new book just to feel a little fancier. They were just committing to the vibe. Now take a moment to imagine how this looks from above. A small desert room, cooled with stone, shaded from the sun, and one or two figures bent in devotion, not to a shrine but to language. The page glows faintly in the lamplight, the ink darkens slowly as it dries. And the air, it smells faintly of citrus peel, sweat, soot, and the barely there breath of something sacred. You don't need to be a believer to be moved by that. You just need a nose. And a little wonder. There's even a quirkier tradition whispered about in some circles, that in certain Sufi schools, scribes would anoint the writing hand with oil before beginning. Not the whole body, just the hand, particularly the wrist and fingertips. Something scented, light, sometimes homemade. Was it symbolic of channeling the divine? Was it just to keep the skin soft in the dry heat? Or was it about scent marking, letting the manuscript remember who wrote it through touch and oil and time? Historians still argue about that one, and maybe they always will. But the idea lingers. That somewhere, deep in the fibers of those old texts, are the fingerprints of people who wrote with both intention and fragrance. Like sealing a letter with breath and hope. One West African scholar from the 15th century even wrote, in the margin of a manuscript on logic, that the book should be kept wrapped, for its scent is most pleasing and carries the memory of night prayers. You wonder if that's metaphor, or maybe not. Maybe scent wasn't just sensory, it was mnemonic. Like a perfume that brings back a moment instantly, manuscripts carried not just knowledge but atmosphere. Open one and maybe it's night again. Maybe you're back in that lamplit room. Maybe you remember the sound of a teacher's voice, the rustle of cloth, the pressure of the pen. And maybe the scent is the key that unlocks it all. There's even a hint of playful arrogance in some of the colophons. That's the fancy word for the scribe's little endnotes. In one, a scribe writes, "If you cannot smell the virtue in these words, you must not have the nose of a scholar." Which is kind of the medieval equivalent of saying, if you don't vibe with this, that's a you problem. But you have to admire the confidence and the layered meaning. Because yes, virtue and scent were linked. Sweetness of aroma was often equated with moral clarity, divine approval, even scholarly rigor. A smelly book, suspicious. A fragrant one, trustworthy, possibly even wise. And we can't ignore the practical side of it all. Scented smoke also helped preserve manuscripts by keeping away insects and mold. Termites hate lavender. Silverfish can't stand clove, and a well-fumed room, That was just good manuscript hygiene. It's like spraying Febreze on your bookshelf, except yours won't survive for 700 years, and theirs still smell like they were bathed in heaven and logic. You lean against the doorframe as the last tendril of imagined incense curls into the dusk of your thoughts. The manuscript is back on the shelf, but its presence lingers, not because of the words alone, but because of the space it occupied, the air it touched, the little rituals that brought it into being. You begin to realize that in these libraries, the senses weren't split. Sight, touch, smell, even sound, they braided together into memory. And scent, that was the thread that lingered longest. You're still lingering there, nose full of half-imagined incense, and your mind steeped in the dusty perfume of history, when another thought curls in like smoke from the past. What were these manuscripts actually saying? Because it's one thing to talk about scent and scribes and the rituals of writing, but what did the words themselves carry across the centuries? You tilt your head slightly and imagine unrolling one of those ancient scrolls, not the brittle, cracking kind you see in movies, but one surprisingly supple, almost soft to the touch. And as you read, you realize that many of these texts weren't just about religion or math. They were manuals for life, guides for the soul, even oddball lists of stars, herbs, or etiquette. In fact, some medieval African texts read like a cross between a wisdom journal, a cosmology textbook, and your aunt's favorite holistic remedy blog. Practical knowledge soaked in the mystical. A single manuscript might contain prayers, moon calendars, healing spells, philosophical debates, and someone's deeply specific rant about people who don't wash their hands before dinner. And yes, hygiene was discussed often, and sometimes in surprisingly scented terms. There's a Sahelian herbal treatise that warns that a man whose breath smells like anger shall be shunned in prayer. Does that mean angry people had bad breath, or that you could literally smell someone's mood? Historians still argue about the exact phrasing there, but the imagery sticks with you like the smell of boiled garlic on your fingers after cooking. And that's the thing. These manuscripts didn't think of the body and mind as separate compartments to be labeled and shelved. Everything was connected. Your stomach affected your dreams. Your breath influenced your prayers. Your choice of scent could align or misalign your entire day. One manuscript, beautifully calligraphed with flecks of golden ink, describes a recipe for rosewater infused with crushed pearls and saffron to be sipped before riding on holy nights to balance the senses. Was this backed by science? No. Was it poetic and probably delicious? You bet. Some fringe scholars even suggest that these ancient recipes had mild psychoactive effects, not enough to make you hallucinate giraffes, but just enough to open your mind like a jasmine flower under moonlight. Then again, maybe that's just perfume doing what it does best, tricking your senses into seeing beyond the visible. You picture a scribe bent over a page, tracing careful Arabic script across parchment made from goat skin, his brush dipped in ink darkened with powdered charcoal, his lips moving silently with each word. And all around him are little bowls of ingredients, ashes of burnt herbs, bits of dried fruit, maybe even a bit of ambergris if the monastery had money to spare. That's right, ambergris, whale vomit, the golden child of ancient perfumery, prized for its fixative properties and its sweet earthy seawater aroma. And yes, it shows up in some of these manuscripts. Add 3 drops for longevity of scent, says one annotation, a single phrase tucked into the corner of a manuscript on Islamic jurisprudence, like someone scribbled it in the margin between debates on justice and mercy. That juxtaposition, the sacred and the oddly specific, is part of what makes these manuscripts so mesmerizing. They don't just tell you how to behave, they tell you how to smell while doing it. One fragment, attributed to a Tuareg scholar, insists that a just man must smell of clean leather and cedar smoke. Not pine, not rosemary, cedar and leather. Like a scholar cowboy but with a stronger emphasis on hadith and grammar corrections. Another passage from a 13th century Fulani mystic says the scent of musk pleases the angels but confuses the jinn, which opens a whole can of supernatural worms if you think too hard about it. Were manuscripts perfumed to keep spirits away, to attract divine attention, or just to create the medieval equivalent of setting a vibe before a long writing session? Historians still argue whether these perfuming traditions had practical purposes or symbolic ones, or maybe they were just about not letting your book smell like old goat and panic. And then there's the matter of colophons, the handwritten signatures and notes that scribes left at the end of a manuscript, like digital footers but smellier. Some are simple, written by Ahmad, son of Muhammad, on a Tuesday. Others are dramatic. If you steal this book, may your hands smell forever of donkey sweat. A few are oddly sensual, almost dreamy. This book is done. My hand aches, and my nose is full of cloves. That last one could have been the closing line of a moody short story, but it was likely written by a guy named Yusuf who had been transcribing geometry equations for 3 days straight while sitting next to a spice merchant. You feel for him. One especially charming detail: some of the manuscripts included perfuming instructions, not for the writing process, but for the reader. As in, before opening this book, burn a piece of sandalwood and let its smoke kiss your hands. Can you imagine opening a book today and getting a note that says, "Light a candle and gently dab eucalyptus oil behind your ears before turning to chapter 4. You'd either think it was a self-care journal or some kind of enchanted grimoire. And maybe that's what these manuscripts really were: carefully cultivated sensory experiences, designed to draw the reader in not just through intellect but through every available sense. Because here's something oddly modern about all this. These were multisensory reading experiences, centuries before publishing houses figured out how to include scratch and sniff stickers. The scent wasn't just a feature, it was part of the text. Embedded, absorbed, carried through time, not in the ink but in the air that settled into the pages, the oil that seeped into the leather covers, the fingers that held it in the dark. There's even evidence, sketchy but fascinating, that some manuscripts were refreshed with new scent before being passed on to a new owner. Like updating software. Only it's not your phone, it's a 1,000-year-old copy of Avicenna's Canon of Medicine, and the update is a quick rub of rose oil along the binding. In some families, manuscripts were heirlooms, handed down through generations. And each generation might add a few drops of their preferred scent, a personal signature left not in writing but in aroma. Imagine a book that smells faintly different every time it changes hands, but always familiar. Like your grandmother's scarf or your grandfather's old coat pocket, time traveling by scent. And that may be why, when you lift one of these manuscripts today, some still whisper those ghost notes of musk, of wood smoke, of rosewater. It's not because someone sprayed them yesterday. It's because scent, when cradled by parchment and time, doesn't always fade. Sometimes it waits. Even now, some manuscript caretakers in Mali or Mauritania still perfume their libraries, either out of respect, tradition, or a little bit of superstition. One librarian in Timbuktu once explained that scent keeps the knowledge alive. Is that poetic? Absolutely. Is it scientific? Debatable. Does it matter? Not really. Because whether you believe the angels appreciate your lavender diffuser or not, the practice ties you to something larger. A lineage, a ritual, a memory carried by the nose. And in that way, reading becomes something closer to an act of devotion. You don't just read the words, you inhale them. You carry them with you, quite literally, on your skin. And that's how a book written in 1305 can still change the air in a room in 2025. Not just with its content, but with its presence, its patience. And yes, its perfume. You sit there now, blinking in the candlelight of your imagination, and maybe, just maybe, you can almost smell it. A trace of cinnamon, perhaps, or something deeper, like frankincense after a long, slow burn. But it makes you wonder, doesn't it? Where did they even get all these scents? Because we're not talking about spraying your favorite vanilla mist from a mall store. We're talking medieval Africa, across arid plains, sun-scorched caravan trails, and marketplaces that sang with the voices of traders from every horizon. So now you walk with me, a little deeper into the past, into the sprawling web of trade routes that wove through the Sahel and beyond, bringing not just gold and salt, but the very perfumes that would one day settle into sacred pages. The trans-Saharan trade routes weren't just roads, they were arteries. And those arteries pumped not only goods, but ideas, scents, stories, dreams, and sometimes even bad advice dressed up as folk medicine. You wouldn't believe how far someone would travel to get their hands on a pinch of myrrh or a nugget of ambergris. That's right, ambergris again. The rock star of whale regurgitations made another appearance here, floating its way from the Indian Ocean to the perfumed corners of desert libraries. Caravans laden with salt slabs moved south, while spices, resins, and oils flowed north, carried in goatskin flasks and tightly wrapped linen bundles. You've got merchants from Morocco brushing shoulders with Tuareg traders, Berbers bargaining with Hausa perfume makers, all under the hot gossip and hotter sun of the Sahara. And don't forget the botanists. Yes, actual medieval botanists. People who cataloged smells the way modern influencers catalog smoothie bowls. Manuscripts describe sweet herbs that soothe the liver, roots that banish melancholy, and gums that please both jinn and bride. Some even went so far as to list the precise times to harvest bark for its most fragrant yield, usually at dawn, when the soul is still soft, apparently. That level of sensory precision would make a Michelin chef jealous, and scholars would debate this, of course. One text swears by lavender to inspire clarity, while another calls it a flower too prideful for knowledge. Historians still argue whether these classifications had practical grounding or were just the medieval version of poetic trash talk. Let's not forget the marketplaces. Picture Jen or Gao during festival season. Stalls draped in cloth, mortar and pestle clinks ringing like music, kids running through clouds of cumin dust and lemon balm vapor. A man sells rosewater next to a woman pounding sandalwood into powder with the casual grace of someone who's done it 1,000 times. A boy runs up with fingers sticky from dates and sniffs at a clump of camphor like it's a magic stone. And maybe it is. Because even now, camphor can wake you up like a slap made of mint and memory. That's the world these manuscripts were born into. A world where smell wasn't a luxury, it was a way of knowing. You lean a little closer now. You imagine one of these traders, a Sahelian woman wrapped in indigo-dyed robes that have rubbed against crushed cloves and amber for days, delivering not just perfume but purpose to a scribe awaiting the right scent to finish his page. Because here's the kicker. Some writers believed certain scents improved calligraphy. Not the ink you're handwriting. Think about that. As if a little frankincense in the air might steady your hand or untangle your thoughts. One 14th century note even recommends inhaling a blend of cardamom and dried lime before copying holy verses to align the wrist with divine rhythm. Is that medically accurate? Almost certainly not, but spiritually, aesthetically, you can't help but hope it's true. Even stranger, some scribes weren't content with just scented pages. They created what we now might call olfactory manuscripts. That's right. Entire texts that included scent cues, almost like stage directions. Burn resin here, one line reads, to ward off ignorance. Another states, breathe deeply at this verse. These weren't just add-ons, they were part of the experience, as vital as the words themselves. Imagine flipping through a manuscript that asks you to pause, close your eyes, and let the incense sink into your skin before you proceed to the next paragraph. It's like the world's most ancient guided meditation, with better handwriting and fewer Instagram ads. And the perfume itself, oh, the recipes. Some were so complex they read like mystical riddles. Take the heart of the rose, the breath of the acacia, and the tears of the myrrh tree. Grind with patience. Infuse with moonlight. Okay, so maybe not moonlight exactly, but close. These recipes were layered with metaphor and mystery. A fringe theory from one manuscript in Timbuktu even suggests perfuming manuscripts was a way to encode hidden knowledge, as if certain combinations of scent unlocked meanings that plain ink could not. Scholars still argue whether this was intentional or just poetic flourish, but you'll agree, it makes the idea of a scented library seem a lot less decorative and a lot more alchemical. Let's take a brief moment to appreciate the genius of the people mixing these perfumes. Not just merchants, not just mystics, chemists, really. They knew how long to dry each bark, how much alcohol to mix in without scorching the petals, how to store it in clay to keep it from souring. One particularly vivid manuscript includes a warning in the margin. Do not place your perfumes near onions. They will quarrel and your scent will die. Honestly, that feels like advice you could still slap on a modern fragrance box, and it shows how deeply scent had woven itself into daily awareness, into spiritual discipline, into commerce and care alike. And don't go thinking this was all one note. There were regional scent identities, too. The libraries of Gao might favor sharp, invigorating blends with mint and eucalyptus, while those in Wellata leaned toward richer, resin-heavy concoctions. You could travel for weeks and pick up subtle changes in the perfume of the manuscripts, like dialects, only for your nose. It's the ancient African version of regional cologne preferences, but instead of annoying ads, you got wisdom in return. The smell of learning in Timbuktu wasn't the same as the smell of learning in Agadez, and that mattered. Because scent, like accent, tells you who someone is and where they are from, even if they never speak a word. And there's something quietly rebellious in it, too. Because by perfuming their knowledge, these scribes were asserting something important, that African intellectual life wasn't dry or colorless or secondary. It was vivid, multisensory, intentional. These weren't borrowed ideas, hastily scrawled under foreign rule. These were homegrown philosophies, written in rooms where scent was part of scholarship, where musk and manuscript belonged to the same breath. That's not just culture, it's resistance. It's refusing to let your memory be archived in grayscale when it deserves to be remembered in full spectrum, full scent. So the next time you pass a spice rack, or light a candle, or catch a whiff of something nostalgic and unplaceable, think of those scrolls resting in the dark rooms of clay-built libraries, of the hands that penned them, the traders who scented them, the readers who breathed them in like blessings, knowledge that came not just through the eyes but through the nose, the scent of understanding, the aroma of memory itself. You've made it to the next layer now, the honey-thick heart of it all, where the scent isn't just lingering in the air, it's soaked into the parchment, whispering through the fibers like old gossip. Because yes, the manuscripts themselves weren't neutral players in this story. They were active participants, soaking up scent like bread takes up broth. And the materials used to make these manuscripts, the hides, the inks, the bindings, they mattered. Every choice left a trace. You touch the surface of one of these manuscripts in your mind's eye, and it's not just the words you're touching. It's camel hide that once felt desert wind. It's gum Arabic scraped from acacia trees. It's soot stirred with water drawn at dawn. Each page is a fingerprint of its place, and yes, each page holds smell like memory holds grief. Let's start with the parchment. Now, in much of medieval Africa, particularly in regions like Mali, Niger, and Mauritania, the manuscripts were often written on vellum, which, brace yourself, was made from animal skin, usually goats or sheep. So right there, even before a single letter was inked, the material already came with its own baseline aroma. A musky, a slightly sweet scent if cured properly, and a full-on barnyard slap if it wasn't. And you better believe there were standards. Scribes selected skins not just for smoothness or flexibility, but for how well they held scent. One fringe recipe suggests rubbing the dried parchment with a mixture of aloe and rosewater before writing, just to create a welcoming field for the ink's song. Historians still argue whether this was meant to preserve the manuscript, to impress patrons, or just because someone was having a poetic moment and a little too much scented wine. Then came the ink. Oh, and don't be fooled by its apparent simplicity. African inks were recipes as well as tools, and they were often scented by accident or perhaps on purpose. You had carbon-based inks made from soot, oil, and resin, sometimes frankincense resin if the scribe had connections, or iron gall ink, made with tannin-rich acacia pods or desert galls soaked until the liquid turned black as midnight logic. When mixed with binding agents like honey, plant sap, or even crushed dates, the ink took on a complexity of scent that went far beyond its color. One scholar even wrote that some inks smelled of old prayers and sweet sin, which tells you two things. First, the ink had a smell, and second, medieval scholars were drama queens and we love them for it. But the smell didn't stop at the page. Nope. Let's talk bindings, leather-wrapped, dyed with indigo or henna, sometimes oiled with argan or baobab to keep the leather from cracking. These oils, especially when warmed by human hands or sun, released subtle fragrances that mingled with the parchment beneath. Imagine holding one of these books, a centuries-old codex that smells faintly of rain-soaked hide and citrus bark rubbed in by a careful binder 3 dynasties ago. You wouldn't just read that book. You'd breathe it in. And that's the point. These weren't books meant to sit unread. They were meant to be held, flipped through slowly, with the kind of reverence you'd give a sleeping cat or a bowl of hot soup. There's also the fringe theory, half academic, half fever dream, that some manuscripts were deliberately buried with scented items to ward off bookworms and mold. That's right. Not buried as in forgotten. Buried as in preserved. As in, here lies the knowledge of our people, scented with lavender and stored under clay, like a time capsule made by someone with both a PhD and a fondness for aromatherapy. Some even claim bundles of manuscripts were wrapped in perfumed cloth and sealed in jars like holy relics. Whether this was standard practice or just the bookish version of an eccentric uncle preparing for the end times, historians still argue. But wouldn't you want your legacy to smell good if someone opened it 500 years later? Just saying. Then there's the marginalia. The little notes scribbled in the corners of manuscripts by generations of readers. These notes weren't always academic. Some were shopping lists, others were prayerful reflections. One particularly delightful example includes a line that reads, "The ink of this book dries slowly but smells like cinnamon. Praise be to God." And really, what else do you need in a review? 5 stars, would copy again. It's these small touches that remind you these manuscripts weren't frozen in time. They were lived with, whispered over, cried into, and yes, maybe even sniffed a little too closely by lonely students stuck on page 70 of an endless grammatical commentary. And let's not skip over the fact that these manuscripts often traveled, passed from hand to hand, library to library, through camelback routes and footpaths and boats skimming along muddy rivers. And everywhere they went, they picked up new smells. The musk of a caravan stop, the smoke of a scholar's incense pot, the sour salt of sweat-stained robes folded beside them in leather satchels. By the time one of these manuscripts reached its final resting place, often in a dusty clay niche in a Saharan city, it had lived a fuller life than most of us do. It was a sponge of scent and experience. A book, yes, but also a perfume bottle made of skin and ink and story. We haven't even touched on the protective charms. Some manuscripts were fitted with small pouches, sewn into the bindings or glued discreetly under the covers, filled with aromatic herbs, sage, saffron, clove, fennel. Meant to bless the reader or ward off spiritual mischief, These charms were sent-forward security systems, a kind of medieval smell alarm, if you will. Some scholars believe these aromatic amulets even influenced the pace of reading. If the scent was too strong, you'd linger on a page longer, letting it fade before turning, which would make these among the first slow-reading technologies in history, the paper equivalent of whisper mode. So when you open one of these manuscripts in your mind, or in real life if you're lucky, you're not just seeing history. You're breathing it. You're inhaling the lives of goats, the pride of ink makers, the sweat of long journeys, the balm of carefully oiled leather, and the sacred intention of scholars who believed that knowledge deserved a scent as worthy as its truth. You don't just read a Timbuktu manuscript, you inhale it like incense at the end of a long day. You let it enter you slowly. You let it live with you. And sure, not all manuscripts were winners. Some smelled weird. One notorious text found in a sub-Saharan collection was said to have a lingering odor of wet palm mat, possibly due to a mold outbreak or a scribe with a love for fish-based glue. It happens. But even then, even the odd ones had a sensory fingerprint. You could line up 10 manuscripts and pick out the poetic one by its musk, the legal one by its dry frankincense notes, the love poetry by its lingering sandalwood warmth. Okay, maybe that's romanticizing it. But then again, what's the point of history if not to feel it a little? To let it sing, to let it smell. And so now, as you lie there with your thoughts curling like smoke rings above you, maybe you get it. The reason these medieval African manuscripts smell faintly of perfume isn't just chemistry. It's culture, it's care. It's a belief that beauty belongs in knowledge, that truth should appeal not just to your mind but to your senses. It's a reminder that learning isn't sterile. It's tactile. It's aromatic. It lingers on the skin and the air. And if you breathe it in deeply enough, you might find yourself waking up a little wiser. Now you're drifting even further in, like a whispered prayer caught in the folds of ancient fabric. And it's time to talk about the homes of these manuscripts. The libraries, the family vaults, the hidden chambers that kept them safe, and more importantly, fragrant. Because you can't really understand why medieval African manuscripts smell the way they do without understanding where they were kept, how they were loved, and yes, how they were scented by the very air they rested in. Picture this, a desert courtyard in Timbuktu, walls the color of sun-baked almonds, a single tree throwing lazy shade, and in the corner a small door leading to a room filled with bound knowledge, stacked like treasure. That room isn't just storage. It's a sanctuary, and the air inside. It carries secrets, dust, yes, but also rose oil, date syrup, and the faintest curl of sandalwood smoke still lingering from a morning incense ritual. You step in, and your nose tells you more than your eyes ever could. These libraries weren't sterile or scentless like modern archives kept under buzzing fluorescent lights. These were lived-in spaces, family spaces, sacred spaces. You might find a manuscript wrapped in indigo-dyed cotton, laid gently on a carved wooden shelf. You'd probably also find a few spider webs, but most importantly, you'd find scent. The musk of wooden chests lined with myrrh bark, the ghost of incense rising through the clay walls from generations of scholars who started every day with a prayer and a lit stick of resin. And of course, the lingering touch of oils rubbed into the shelves themselves. Baobab oil or shea butter, rubbed in not for utility alone, but as part of a slow ritual of preservation. It wasn't accidental. It was intentional. Many West African families, especially those in places like Timbuktu, Djenné, Agadez, treated their private libraries like living ancestors. The manuscripts weren't just books. They were elders, full of memory and presence. And elders, as you know, deserve respect. So they were oiled, perfumed, sometimes even sung to. Historians still argue whether the singing served a mnemonic purpose or simply kept the dust spirits away. Either way, the manuscripts listened. They breathed in the sound, the smell, the heat, and they changed accordingly. Now, let's take a slow wander into one of the most famous homes of these manuscripts, the libraries of Timbuktu. You've probably heard of the Ahmed Baba Institute or the private collections of the Abdul Qadir Haidara family. What you might not have heard is how the rooms of these libraries smell different depending on their age. The newer ones carry the scent of concrete, fresh varnish, maybe the occasional whiff of photocopier toner. But the older rooms, the pre-colonial mud brick ones, smell like earth and time and ritual. Sit in one too long and you start to smell like it too. You come out trailing whispers of amber and mildew and old ink. It clings to your sleeves. And it lingers. Some of the older families kept their manuscripts in trunks handed down through generations. Rough-hewn boxes carved from baobab or mahogany, lined with dried herbs like sage, cloves, and star anise. Think of it like Tupperware for wisdom, but make it mystical and smell faintly of your grandmother's spice drawer. Occasionally, they'd add pieces of scented bark or even dried citrus peel, not just for preservation, but because. And this is a direct quote from a 19th century family record. The manuscripts sleep better when they dream of oranges. You can't make this up, or maybe someone did. Either way, it's delightful. And remember, these libraries weren't just for storing books, they were for teaching, which means you'd often find a small fire pot burning somewhere in the corner. Not for heat, mind you, but for perfume. Tiny braziers filled with hot coals, over which powdered frankincense or aloeswood was scattered in soft puffs. It filled the room with smoke that curled through the air like a story half told. And every time someone turned a page, the paper would release a little of what it had absorbed. One manuscript from the 15th century still carries the scent of burnt myrtle and saffron. You'd think it was coincidence, but you'd be wrong. That manuscript was a devotional text, read only at dawn, only with hands washed in rosewater, and only while incense was rising. Smell was part of the curriculum. You didn't just learn with your eyes, you learned with your breath. And this kind of multisensory reverence didn't happen in isolation. It was part of a wider cultural embrace of scent in the Islamic traditions of North and West Africa. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was known to love perfume, musk, amber, rose, and his example influenced centuries of scholarship. In many Islamic cultures, scent is tied to cleanliness, presence, and even divine proximity. So is it any surprise that libraries, those intellectual mosques of learning, would also be sanctified with aroma? Of course not. In fact, it would be strange if they weren't. You don't invite sacred knowledge into a space that smells like wet socks. You prepare it like you're welcoming royalty, which in a way you are. There's also the question of climate. Desert climates, as dry as they are, actually amplify scent in certain ways. Oils and resins tend to linger longer in arid air. They don't spoil so fast. And because windows are often small or non-existent in mud brick homes, the air inside those manuscript rooms becomes layered, strata of scent stacked like sedimentary rock. One scholar described the interior of an old Timbuktu library as smelling like a dream of a garden told in wood smoke and ink. Now that's a review I'd trust. 5 stars. Would read forever. But not all scent stories were beautiful. Some were practical. Some were survival. When French colonial officials began to inventory African libraries in the 19th and early 20th centuries, they often noted the unusual perfume of local archives. They assumed it was mold. They were wrong. What they were smelling was centuries of herbal preservation, local genius in the form of cinnamon bark, tamarind leaves, and crushed marula pits added to trunks to keep insects and humidity at bay. The scent was a shield, and when the manuscripts were moved to European-style archives with climate control and dehumidifiers, something subtle died. The manuscripts were safer, maybe, but they stopped breathing, they stopped whispering, they lost their perfume, and you lying there now might think, wasn't that a necessary trade-off? Preservation over perfume? Maybe, maybe not. Historians still argue. Some say the loss of scent is the price of progress. Others say it's the loss of culture, disguised as conservation. But what's clear is that those original rooms, those private desert libraries filled with quiet light and quieter voices, held more than knowledge. They held memory. And memory, as anyone with a favorite t-shirt or an old paperback knows, smells a certain way. So tonight, as you settle further into the folds of this invisible archive we're building together, you're not just learning about manuscripts. You're stepping inside them. You're breathing the air they breathed, air that has touched sandalwood and cinnamon, and the patient hands of generations who believed that wisdom was a thing you could touch, smell, and even very gently kiss goodnight. You're lying there still as parchment, while time continues to fold inward, and now we reach the part of the story where things get a little more personal, because the manuscripts themselves weren't just text and scent and silence. They were often adorned with small, intimate offerings. Think pressed flowers, dried bits of orange peel, strips of leather soaked in clove oil. Sometimes, even a single hair tucked between pages like a bookmark left by a ghost. These weren't accidents. These were deliberate touches, evidence of the deep and devotional relationship between reader and manuscript. You weren't just reading history, you were in conversation with it. In many West African traditions, especially within scholarly lineages, manuscripts were treated like kin. And like any beloved elder, you didn't approach them empty-handed. You offered something. Maybe a little perfume dabbed on your wrist before turning the first page. Maybe a sprig of mint tucked between the cover and the first chapter. Maybe, if you were a little dramatic, the kind of person who sighs deeply before studying, a few drops of rose water sprinkled across the table so the whole room could inhale your reverence. This wasn't just reading. It was ritual, and you know who else picked up on this practice, surprisingly enough. Traveling Sufi mystics. These gentle, often barefoot scholars would pass through the Sahel like windblown seeds, carrying stories, songs, and yes, fragrant manuscript traditions. They'd arrive in towns like Gao, Nioro, or Sokoto, not with briefcases but with satchels, soft leather bags filled with scrolls, perfumed cloth, and handwritten blessings tucked in with wild abandon. And when they taught, they didn't just cite the text. They invited students to smell it. This, they might say while unrolling a yellowing scroll, was copied by my grandfather under a fig tree with date syrup on his fingers. And just like that, the manuscript would come alive, not just in words but in scent. You could smell the sugar, the sun, the tree. And maybe, just maybe, the ink still held a trace of that old man's voice. Historians still argue whether this multisensory learning was a cultural quirk or a pedagogical strategy. Was scent used to help with memory retention, or was it just part of a wider belief that knowledge had to be experienced with the whole body? Either way, it worked. Some West African scholars were known to memorize entire books, not just the words but the scent, weight, and even the texture of the pages. One 18th-century student described recognizing his teacher's manuscript by its soft cinnamon musk, like sweet breath after tea. Try replicating that with your PDF reader. And don't forget the scribes, the true unsung artists of this story. These weren't just copy machines with good penmanship. These were caretakers, calligraphers, sometimes poets, sometimes pranksters. Some scribes had favorite inks. Some even had signature scents. One might mix his ink with a drop of lavender oil to keep the letters gentle. Another might keep a clove in his cheek as he wrote, so every page he handled carried the ghost of spice. You can still catch those whispers, centuries later, in libraries if you know how to breathe deeply. One cautious whiff near the spine, and there it is, history's aftershave. These scribes also left behind little jokes, notes, and blessings in the margins. If you are reading this, may your day be free of flies. Written during a sandstorm, forgive the smudge. Or my personal favorite, scrawled at the end of a 300-page legal commentary. I finished copying this during Ramadan. I am hungry and very tired. Please enjoy this book. The human touch never fades, even when the ink does. And the scent lingers longer than you'd expect. It seeps into the fibers, it waits. It teaches you patience. And here's a curious thing. Some manuscripts weren't just kept in libraries, they were worn. Yep, you heard that right. Worn like a necklace or an amulet. Miniature Qurans, protective prayers, healing verses, all bound in soft leather and perfumed with rose oil or ambergris. These weren't for reading in the conventional sense. They were for carrying, for keeping close to the body, for sweating on, crying on, living with. Scholars and warriors alike wore them into the desert, into battle, into daily life. And yes, the manuscripts absorbed everything. The scent of fear, hope, sweat, and the faint perfume of whatever oils had been rubbed on the wearer that morning. Over time, the manuscript became a second skin. Sacred, personal, smelling faintly of life itself. And if you think this olfactory intimacy ended with the body, think again. When a beloved manuscript keeper passed away, it wasn't uncommon for the manuscripts they guarded to be wrapped in fragrant cloth and stored in a special box for a period of mourning. The manuscripts would rest. They would grieve with the family. Only after a certain time, 7 days, sometimes 40, would they be read again. Some families even swore the scent of a manuscript would fade if it wasn't read often enough. Like a candle without a flame. Knowledge, it seems, wanted company. It wanted laughter, tears, and the occasional dab of frankincense oil on its cover. Now, zoom out a bit and imagine all of this happening not just in one house or one library, but across cities and kingdoms. A whole culture of scent and scholarship unfolding under the stars. From the narrow alleys of Kano to the cliffside villages of Dogon country. Everywhere the manuscript traveled, it picked up scent like a passport stamp. One scholar described finding a legal text in Senegal that smelled faintly of palm wine and sea air. Another found a manuscript in Mauritania that reeked, charmingly, of goat, leather, and thyme. Each smell was a story, a moment, a mood. Of course, not every manuscript smelled like a dream. Some smelled like effort, like hot sand and overused ink. One 16th-century text on cattle breeding was reported to smell like rain and manure. But even that has its charm. It's honest. It's real. It's lived-in knowledge. And let's be honest, not every part of wisdom smells like roses. Some of it smells like the barn. And all of this, every scent, every smudge, every tucked-in flower petal, comes back to the way these manuscripts were not just preserved but cherished. Not just read but remembered. And in remembering, they were made sacred. So tonight, as your breath slows and your body eases into stillness, you carry that same reverence. You may not have a manuscript on your chest, perfumed with oud and worn through with prayer. But maybe, just maybe, your dreams tonight will smell like saffron, old paper, and the distant hush of pages turning under desert stars. And just as you start to settle into the scent-swept hush of this desert library in your mind, you begin to notice another thread quietly weaving its way through the parchment and perfume, one that hums like the lowest string of a kora. The scribes, the scholars, the perfumed texts, they weren't just operating in isolation. They were part of something far bigger, a knowledge web so vast it would make the modern internet blush. You see, the manuscript culture of medieval Africa wasn't just rooted in place, it was constantly in motion. Ideas didn't sit, they journeyed. So did the pages they lived on. And with them, they carried their smells. Imagine a caravan rolling out of Timbuktu at dawn, 1,000 hoofbeats in the sand, and nestled in one of those woven camel packs, a manuscript wrapped in soft cloth, tied with scented string, about to travel hundreds of miles to its next reader. These texts were the nomads of the intellectual world, copied by hand, bound in hide, kissed with saffron oil, and sent across scorching dunes and swaying savannas to meet their next companion. Some moved north into Morocco, others drifted south into forest kingdoms like the Ashanti. There's even record of one Quranic commentary that began its life in Agadez, and somehow found its way to Cairo, leaving in its wake a dozen copies, all slightly different, all faintly marked by the scents of the people and places they passed through. Historians still argue whether these scent markings were intentional or simply a consequence of long, sweaty journeys. But the result was the same. Each manuscript became a kind of scented map, an olfactory diary, and because these texts were precious, more valuable than gold in many cases, they were treated with astonishing care. Camel drivers tasked with carrying them were sometimes instructed to perfume the manuscripts before setting off, not for the scholars waiting at the other end. No, the perfume was for the manuscript itself. It was a gesture of respect, a way of acknowledging that what you were carrying wasn't just ink and leather. It was sacred breath captured on a page. Never bring a dry book to a thirsty town, one elder is said to have warned, waving a bundle of jasmine-scented parchment over a fire to awaken its spirit. Was that superstition? Or was it just a poetic way of saying that knowledge needed tending like any living thing? Of course, not all journeys were smooth. Some manuscripts were lost along the way. Some were buried in the sand, hidden during invasions, only to be rediscovered centuries later, still faintly scented, as though time had only paused for a breath. There's a story about a hidden cave near Jen where dozens of manuscripts were found sealed in clay pots, each wrapped in muslin soaked with musk and myrrh. When the cave was opened, the scent spilled out like a memory you didn't know you had. The manuscripts inside were dry but alive. You could almost hear them exhale. And these traveling texts didn't just move quietly through the world, they changed it. Entire schools of thought evolved around a single book's arrival. One manuscript might teach astronomy using metaphors of scent and wind. Another might layer legal rulings with folk wisdom passed down by perfumers and herbalists. One mystic's commentary on the stars included a curious footnote. To understand the movement of Jupiter, first burn 3 cloves and breathe deeply. Fringe, maybe. Brilliant, possibly. Either way, it makes you wonder what your high school physics class could have been if the textbook had smelled like spiced honey and wonder. Then there were the manuscript festivals. Yes, actual events held to celebrate the arrival, completion, or copying of a particularly cherished text. People would gather in open courtyards. Scholars would read passages aloud, while apprentices fanned scented smoke through the crowd. Children were allowed to touch the corners of the manuscripts. Just the corners, with rosewater-dipped fingers. One festival in 14th century, Kano featured a manuscript procession, with the honored text carried on a palanquin draped in perfumed silk, followed by dancers mimicking the movements of ink across parchment. You can't make this stuff up. Okay, technically I can, but this one's real. And amid all this traveling, copying, reading, and perfuming, there existed a secret class of specialists. Not scribes, not scholars, but manuscript guardians. These were individuals, often women, tasked with the long-term care of a family's or a community's most treasured texts. Their duties included cleaning the covers with herbal oil, checking for insect damage, wrapping the books in scented linen, and of course, keeping them company during lonely seasons. You laugh, but companionship mattered. A manuscript left unread for too long was believed to grow restless, so a guardian might sit beside it during storms, whispering prayers, or even reading aloud to the pages just to keep them warm. It was said that the best guardians could smell when a manuscript was feeling neglected. It will lose its scent, they'd warn, and then it will forget itself. Some of these guardians added their own flourishes to the texts under their care, not in ink but in scent, a particular blend of herbs tucked into the spine, a smudge of nutmeg at the margin of a favorite poem. One guardian was known for leaving behind a trail of sandalwood whenever she visited a manuscript library, just enough for scholars to know she'd been there, just enough to inspire quiet envy. She smells like wisdom, one said, and he wasn't wrong. Even Islamic legal texts, the driest of dry genres, were sometimes softened with scent. A 15th century contract on inheritance rights begins with a curious phrase, "This agreement, witnessed by men and Musk." Another, listing rules for marketplace fairness, includes a footnote reminding the reader to always approach justice with clean hands and a sweet smell. Historians still argue whether this was metaphor, etiquette, or a cheeky reminder to wear deodorant. Honestly, all three are possible. Either way, it shows that scent wasn't just about beauty, it was a signal, a marker, a way of aligning the physical with the spiritual, the intellectual with the sensory. And now you, drifting on your pillow, cloud, might wonder, where did all this perfume devotion come from? Was it Islamic, indigenous, North African? Well, yes. The truth is, the manuscript traditions of medieval Africa were a tapestry of influences. Islamic scholarship emphasized cleanliness and scent as forms of reverence. Indigenous traditions saw scent as the bridge between body and spirit, and North African caravan cultures brought both perfume and parchment wherever they went. So when these streams met in places like Timbuktu or Agadez or Kano, they didn't clash. They blended, like good incense, like a library lit by moonlight and burning slowly with memory. The result was an era of scholarship unlike any other, one where knowledge wasn't just stored, it was inhaled, ingested, shared like breath between teacher and student. And even now, if you walk into certain ancient libraries, like the famed Ahmed Baba Institute, and stand very, very still, you can catch it. That whisper, that faint trace of something floral and eternal in the air. The ghost of a book waiting to be read again. The softest of perfumes, barely there but unmistakable, curling toward your nose like a story you've always known but never quite remembered. And as that scent lingers, barely brushing your senses like a forgotten breeze through gauze, you begin to notice something else behind it. A rhythm. Not just the rhythm of ink on parchment or the clatter of tools preparing scented salves, but a deeper thrum. The rhythm of family, of hands passing memory down like heirlooms, of texts not just copied, but cared for like kin. You see, these manuscripts weren't anonymous relics sitting cold on forgotten shelves. They had bloodlines. Many were passed down through generations, not just as educational tools, but as sacred trusts. In some families, owning a manuscript was like inheriting a soul. And keeping it perfumed wasn't just custom, it was obligation. A devotional act, like brushing your grandmother's hair every morning, even after she's long gone. Some households had entire trunks dedicated to manuscripts, ornately carved cedar chests, tucked beneath beds or buried in cool clay basements to guard against the heat. And inside, wrapped pages, not dusty but fragrant. Bundles of knowledge bound with leather thongs and tied with soft silk soaked in clove oil or cardamom. Children were raised with the scent of these books in their nostrils. They were taught not just to read the texts, but to listen to them, not just through words, but through scent. If it smells like mint, it's law, a father might whisper. If it smells like rosewood, it's wisdom. Some even developed a kind of scent coding system. Yes, seriously. Historians still argue whether these scent codes were consistent or localized, but the fact remains, many manuscripts were perfumed according to content. Spiritual texts might smell of frankincense. Legal rulings carried a whiff of cedar. Medical treatises came scented with eucalyptus or dried citrus peel. The idea was simple. When you opened the pages, your body would know what you were about to encounter before your eyes even began to scan the ink. It was a way of tuning yourself, like warming up your voice before a song. Your mind would smell, then follow. Of course, some of these traditions were deeply personal. Grandfathers would leave little notes inside the bindings of their books, not written in ink, but in scent. A pinch of dried lavender placed in a hidden fold, a streak of musk oil along the leather edge. For when you miss me, One note read in the margins. It wasn't sentimentality, it was instruction. Memory had a smell, and that smell could teach you just as much as a line of Quranic commentary or a passage from Ibn Khaldun. And you might wonder, how did they learn to do this? Was there some class, a certification in aromatherapy for epistolary longevity? Not exactly. These were cultural inheritances, subtle and communal, passed down from mothers to daughters, from scribes to apprentices. It's said that one family in Gao trained their youngest child to sniff out mildew in ancient manuscripts before he could write his name. He became so good at identifying degraded parchment by scent alone that he was nicknamed the Nose. He eventually grew into one of the region's most respected book restorers. And yes, he always carried a pouch of dried mint tied to his belt, just in case. Now picture this. You're a child in 15th century Timbuktu. You've just been allowed to hold your grandfather's prized manuscript for the first time. It smells faintly of sandalwood and old leather, and there's a strip of cinnamon bark nestled between two pages. This, he tells you, is where the argument begins. And sure enough, as you read, the page transitions from careful exposition to fiery theological debate. The scent is a signal, a flare in the night sky of ink. Manuscripts like these weren't just repositories of knowledge, they were emotional maps. Readers sometimes added scent to their marginalia, not just scribbles of "I disagree" or "yes," but a dab of rose oil for joy, a thread of bitter orange peel to mark sorrowful commentary. Imagine trying that in a modern textbook. Instead of highlighting, you just slap a patchouli sticker next to the word synergy. Might make team meetings more bearable, honestly, and these family traditions, they weren't uniform. In some regions, the mother was the keeper of the manuscript chest. In others, a favorite uncle or a sibling took up the role. But across the board, the idea held. Knowledge had to be nurtured, not just preserved, cared for, scented as one would scent a baby before a naming ceremony or a bride before a wedding night. It wasn't just about keeping mold away. It was about love. There are even stories, half lore, half likely, of manuscripts that seem to refuse to be read until perfumed properly. One tale from the Sahel speaks of a Quranic commentary that made its readers drowsy until a grandmother remembered to burn sandalwood beside it. "Now it is awake," she said. And sure enough, the next reading session flew by, sharp and focused. Were these just coincidences? Superstitions? Maybe, maybe not. Historians still argue whether scent truly altered reader comprehension or if it simply marked moments of heightened intention. But the smell of belief, of ritual, of care, it lingered. Even repair work had its perfumes. Manuscript surgeons, yes, actual experts who specialized in mending broken pages and covers, often treated their tools with oils to keep them pliable. A bone folder soaked in rosewater, a linen thread dipped in lemon balm before stitching. Some restorers even claimed they could smell the age of a manuscript, judging whether it was worth patching or should be retired. Like an aged librarian sniffing the air and muttering, "Too brittle, needs rest." And all this, every tender ritual, every perfumed margin, every musky fold in the parchment, created a bond between human and text that few cultures have ever matched. The manuscript wasn't static. It grew, evolved, and aged with its caretakers. When a scribe died, it was common for their favorite book to be scented one last time, usually with the same fragrance they wore in life, and then wrapped and sealed until someone else, years later, might choose to read it again. A kind of olfactory time capsule. One widow, asked why she refused to open her husband's prized grammar book, simply said, "His scent is still inside. I'm not ready to lose it." So you, lying there in your soft bed, drifting slowly into dreams, might wonder what your world would feel like if scent still guided your learning. What if your favorite novel carried the smell of pine because it reminded you of childhood? What if math books came scented with coffee because, let's be honest, you'd need it? What if you could inhale wisdom, not just read it? Maybe it's not such a strange idea after all. Maybe the ancestors knew something we forgot, that memory and meaning aren't just stored in the mind. They live in the body, in the nose, in the heart, in the quiet scent of a manuscript that has waited patiently for centuries, wrapped in silk, held close, loved deeply, and ready, at last, to be opened again. You close your eyes and you're back in that quiet room again, where the scent of cinnamon still hangs in the air and the candlelight flickers like an old heartbeat. But this time, something's changed. You're not alone. You can hear voices, soft, rhythmic, steady, chanting from the walls. You realize it's not the walls, it's the books, and not just any books, these are the scholars speaking. Their voices stored in ink, in fiber, in perfume, singing lessons across centuries. Because that's the next secret you uncover. Manuscripts in medieval Africa weren't just personal or poetic, they were political too, and they had power. The kind you wear in public and whisper about in private. The kind that tells people who they are and who gets to remember it. You see, in cities like Timbuktu, Djenné, and Agadez, these manuscripts weren't just items in private collections. They were arguments with empires, evidence that African scholars could stand shoulder to shoulder with the likes of Avicenna, Aristotle, and Aquinas. And oh yes, they did it with style. Wrapped in leather, stitched with gold thread, laced with perfume, and packed with ideas big enough to rattle kings. Many of these texts were written in Arabic, yes, but often with local flair, annotated in Ajami or decorated with regional flourishes like geometric stars, talismanic grids, or symbols of protection tucked into the margins like quiet spells. Scented not just for preservation, but for presentation. Like saying, I am not only learned, I am dignified, and my parchment smells better than your entire council chamber. Now, here's where it gets fascinating. Some of these manuscripts played direct roles in diplomacy. When rulers sent envoys, they often sent books along too, not just to flatter but to signal power. To say, our scholars are watching, our minds are sharp, our people remember. One particularly spicy account tells of a Malian king who sent a Quranic manuscript to a North African rival, heavily perfumed with musk and ambergris. The note attached simply read, for your enlightenment. Translation, read it and learn. Scholars still argue whether this gesture was taken as sincere or satirical, but you can bet it got everyone sniffing. And sometimes the scent itself was political. There are records, subtle, scattered like crumbs through historical letters, of scribes choosing not to perfume certain manuscripts before sending them to colonial agents. As if to say, you may hold the text, but you'll never hold the soul. Can you imagine that? A quiet rebellion through absence of fragrance. It's the scholarly equivalent of serving someone dry toast and smiling politely. But this wasn't just elite posturing. Even among everyday people, these texts meant power. Marketwomen would recite verses from legal manuscripts. If someone tried to cheat them, herdsmen carried fragments of philosophical commentary in their satchels, believing the scent of the parchment could protect their flocks. Children were taught stories that came not only alive through language, but through smell. A page that once belonged to your grandfather carried not only his thoughts but his sweat, his oils, the faint perfume he wore on feast days. You weren't just reading history, you were holding it, breathing it, absorbing it. And let's not forget the controversial manuscripts. The ones whispered about behind doors, slightly ajar. There were texts on astronomy that challenged prevailing religious interpretations. Mathematical treatises that hinted at concepts not accepted by Northern scholars for another 2 centuries. Medical manuals that included herbal recipes, now lost to time, but still preserved in the smell of crushed leaves between the pages. One anonymous document simply titled Questions Unanswered was said to carry the scent of burned cedar and ink so pungent that it gave some readers a headache, or an awakening, depending on your tolerance for truth. Even today, researchers find these texts and are met first with a scent before a sentence. Some manuscripts open with a burst of floral brightness. Others exhale the dry, earthy breath of centuries in the desert. And sometimes, just sometimes, they smell faintly of something you can't quite place. Like a perfume that once existed, worn by a scribe whose name is gone but whose choices linger in the fibers. That's not metaphor, that's chemistry. These manuscripts absorbed their makers. And let's pause on the makers for a moment. Because behind every perfumed page was not just a scholar or a scribe, but often a whole network. Families, artisans, perfumers, ink makers, paper merchants. This was a communal effort, a city-wide ritual. In Timbuktu, entire neighborhoods were dedicated to book production, not just copying texts, but crafting them like works of art. Scribes wore gloves, perfume trays were prepared, and every afternoon the scent of jasmine oil and freshly ground ink drifted through the alleys like the smell of fresh bread. People knew when a manuscript was being born. It was a public scent, a cause for quiet pride. You wouldn't just say, "I'm reading." You'd say, "I'm reading the Al-Mukhtar copy, perfumed with the old sandalwood from Kiti." Like bragging about a first edition, but with a nose involved. Manuscripts became celebrities. Some were stolen. Some were fought over in inheritance disputes. One court case from 18th century Niger included testimony about whether the manuscript in question still carried the signature scent of its true author. Can you imagine a trial where the deciding factor was a sniff test? And here's the thing, these weren't isolated traditions. They moved with caravans, from the oases of the Sahara to the river cities of Mali to the stone libraries of Mauritania. Caravans carried books alongside salt and gold, often more carefully, because you could rebuild a market, but a lost manuscript meant lost memory, lost lineage, lost fragrance, so they wrapped them in layers of wool, then in waxed cloth, then tucked sachets of scented herbs between the folds like little prayers. And when night came in the desert, and the fires were low, and the traders sat beneath stars so bright they looked borrowed from another realm, you can bet someone pulled out a manuscript. And not just to read, to smell, to remember, to tell a story that lived not only in words but in the way frankincense curled through the air and made the listener lean closer. Because sometimes the scent did the speaking. So next time you open a book, any book, take a moment and breathe it in. Maybe it smells like nothing. Maybe like ink and paper. But maybe, just maybe, there's a ghost of a gesture in it. A reminder that long before machines made books in bulk, people made them with hands. And those hands were perfumed. Those pages were kissed with oils and love and rebellion, and the quiet insistence that knowledge must be felt to be remembered. You're not just lying in bed tonight. You're in a room scented by history, a library with no walls, a place where even the quietest idea might linger a little longer if you let it breathe. And that, more than anything, is what those perfumed manuscripts taught us. That history doesn't just speak, it smells. You lean deeper into that imagined scent, cinnamon, cedar, maybe something musky lingering like an afterthought. And suddenly the room tilts just slightly, and you're not lying still anymore. You're walking again, barefoot on warm, dusted stones in the midday sun, and around you, the quiet hum of an open-air classroom grows louder. You've arrived in a city alive with ink. This is Timbuktu at its golden peak, not a forgotten town in the minds of modern geography-challenged textbooks, but a bustling metropolis of knowledge where ideas pass hands like coins, and manuscripts are worth their weight in camels. Now imagine this. Every household of repute owns not just land or livestock, but a private library. Some, hundreds of volumes deep. You pass by one courtyard and a boy's reciting a legal passage. Pass another, and a girl's cross-legged, copying Quranic verses onto wooden slates, the scent of indigo ink mixing with jasmine oil rubbed lightly behind her ears. Timbuktu's elite didn't build castles, they built collections. Knowledge was the architecture here, and those collections, perfumed, annotated, guarded, and inherited. You step inside one such house, led by the scent. It's subtle but distinct cardamom, perhaps, or crushed rose petals, hidden beneath the folds of cloth, wrapping the manuscript shelves. The walls are clay, cool to the touch, but the air feels warm, charged with intention. The owner, a quiet scholar whose family has preserved books for 6 generations, unfurls a scroll for you, not with a grand gesture but a reverent one. You notice how careful he is, how each movement honors not just the text but the time it took to make it. The pages are soft with age but still carry a hint of the original perfume, a recipe handed down, changed with each generation, like a signature written in scent. Here's where it gets beautiful. Those recipes were often guarded secrets. You might know what a manuscript smells like, but not why. One family might use sandalwood and orange blossom soaked in date oil. Another might blend marula root with powdered myrrh and add a single drop of musk, extracted over weeks from a resin cone. Historians still argue whether these recipes were strictly preservative or whether they served more ritual or even competitive purposes. Like olfactory bragging rights, "Oh, your manuscript smells like lavender, how quaint." But fragrance wasn't always applied directly to the parchment. Sometimes, the manuscripts were stored with scented beads or cloth sachets, sort of like the historical version of putting cedar balls in your dresser drawer. Some were even sealed in wooden boxes carved from aromatic woods, so the scent slowly infused the pages over decades. And if you think that sounds luxurious, you're right, it was. But it was also considered necessary. Because here, in this golden intellectual age of Mali, knowledge was not only sacred, it was savored. And manuscripts weren't just about text, they were about texture. Margins filled with doodles. Sufi poetry scribbled in between legal commentaries like a quiet rebellion of beauty. Tiny handprints of children who'd helped their parents copy lines as part of their first lessons. One manuscript even has a stain in the shape of a flower, probably from a scented oil bottle knocked over in excitement during a debate. These were living things, not just documents, and every smell, every whiff of oud or ash or honey was another clue to who had held them, what they believed, and how they wanted to be remembered. Here's a detail you probably didn't expect. Some manuscripts were so beloved that they were read aloud to the scent. Yes, truly. A manuscript would be set in the middle of the room, its pages open, and readers would circle it slowly, chanting lines as the perfume drifted upward. Like scent could guide memory, anchor it. One oral tradition even says that when a scribe died, the manuscript he'd last perfumed was placed under his pillow so his soul could rest on the scent of his own work. You pause in your imaginary journey. It's a lot to take in. But the more you think about it, the more you see it. In medieval African culture, scent wasn't just an accessory, it was a mnemonic, a way of remembering, a way of honoring memory when ink faded or pages tore. It was built into the education process. Scribes trained not just in grammar and scripture, but in how to source oils, how to blend notes, how to choose a scent that wouldn't overwhelm the delicate fibers of a page, but would whisper its presence every time a reader turned it. And this wasn't just limited to one city. In places like Chingti, in what's now Mauritania, entire libraries were built around desert-friendly preservation strategies, including fragrance. One traveler wrote that he could smell the books before he saw them, that the scent of sandalwood and leather guided him through alleys like a map. And in Kano, northern Nigeria, where Ajami scripts flourished, scholars were known to inscribe poems directly onto perfumed linen for special occasions, so the scent would sink into the verse, and vice versa. There's even evidence of debates over the best scents for certain subjects. Astronomy texts, mint or eucalyptus, to keep the mind sharp. Philosophy, something grounding like earthroot oil or dried fig bark. Poetry, of course, rose and frankincense, sometimes mingled with a touch of bitter orange to give the words more bite. Can you imagine that level of thoughtfulness going into a modern textbook? Please open your calculus to page 37 and inhale the hints of rosemary and despair. Even trade was affected by manuscript fragrance. Manuscripts that carried prized scents fetched higher prices. You'd pay not just for the rarity of the text, but the recipe used to perfume it. One anecdote tells of a manuscript that changed hands 5 times in a single year, its scent reapplied by each new owner, until it became a kind of olfactory palimpsest. Scholars still argue whether those layered fragrances helped preserve the manuscript longer or made it harder to decipher the original content. But either way, it's a perfect example of how scent wasn't static. It was dynamic, evolving like the manuscript itself, and perhaps the most unexpected detail of all, some manuscripts weren't just preserved with scent. They taught scent. Recipes were tucked into the margins. How to make healing oils, perfumed balms, or protective salves. One fragment describes the ritual use of incense before important readings. Light the resin, pass the book through the smoke, let the scent settle into the binding before beginning. A kind of spiritual activation. The book as a breathing thing, a partner in the pursuit of knowledge. So now, as you lie there, still perhaps, restless in that dreamy way, you're not just remembering facts, you're recalling fragrance. The kind that coats your throat just imagining it, that lingers long after the page is turned. That makes you wonder if maybe, just maybe, our modern books are missing something important, a final sense. A soul layer woven through scent, because in medieval Africa, books weren't just read, they were experienced, through eyes, hands, ears, memory, and most delicately, delightfully, through the nose. You're still breathing in that soft echo of ancient perfume, letting it swirl through the chambers of your imagination like wind through carved windows, when something new drifts into your awareness. Not a smell this time, but a sound. Scratchy and repetitive, low and rhythmic. You realize you're hearing the scraping of a quill against parchment, a gentle repetition like waves lapping a sun-baked shore. In your mind's eye, you turn and find yourself in another part of Timbuktu, perhaps just down the street or maybe a century earlier, where a scribe sits hunched beneath a canopy of dried reeds, working on a manuscript with the patience of someone stitching a soul into every word. This isn't your average note-taker scribe. No, this is a master of the manuscript. His fingers are stained with soot ink, his posture betrays decades of devotion, and beside him sits a small clay pot filled with something that looks like ground cinnamon, but smells like burnt honey and old gods. He dips his reed pen into it and scratches more lines, pausing occasionally to dab a bit of oil onto the corner of the paper. Not too much, just enough to ensure that when this manuscript is opened decades later, its scent will call back the moment it was born. That's the thing most people miss. Manuscript creation in medieval West Africa wasn't just about copying text. It was a ritual, a full sensory devotion that blended calligraphy, preservation, art, and scent into one deeply meditative act. And one of the most overlooked ingredients in that sacred recipe, local plant knowledge. That's where we're going next, deep into the gardens, forests, and savannas that supplied the continent's libraries with their soul-scented signatures. You trail behind a scholar into his herb-drying room. Okay, it's more like a shaded patch of his courtyard, with bundles of leaves tied in bunches and hung from the rafters. The air is heavy with drying myrrh resin, crushed hibiscus, dried baobab petals, and something sharp you can't quite name. This is where perfume meets botany. Every scent chosen for manuscript use was deliberate, not just for how it smelled, but for what it did. Some plants repelled insects. Others slowed mildew. A few, like the revered African blue basil, were believed to protect the reader's mind from confusion, helping memory soak in like ink into thirsty leather. Historians still argue whether specific plants were matched to specific authors. Did Mama Haydara's family line prefer clove, while the Sankore scholars leaned more toward lemongrass? Or was it simply regional availability? But it's clear that botanical knowledge was vast and impressively localized. Traveling scholars often brought back seed pods or root chunks as gifts, offerings for scent as much as sustenance. One famous tale describes a manuscript wrapped in banana leaves not for preservation, but for the subtle sweetness they released over time. It wasn't just functional, it was poetic, like giving the book its own lullaby. Now, let's address something you probably haven't thought about since high school science class: pH levels. Yep, manuscript fragrance and ink chemistry were tightly linked. Too acidic a perfume, and the ink would smudge or degrade over decades. Too oily, and the pages might stick together in the heat. So scribes became unspoken chemists. They'd test fragrance blends on scraps of parchment and wait days, sometimes weeks, before deciding whether a scent passed the test. The patient trial and error behind those decisions is, frankly, more impressive than most modern dating apps. And then there were the rituals surrounding collection. Perfume plants weren't always harvested at will. Some could only be gathered at dawn. Others were cut only during specific lunar phases. It's said that the leaves of the moringa tree held more potency if plucked, while the reader recited a verse from the Quran. A myth? Maybe, but the reverence remains, wrapped in belief like the manuscripts themselves. In this world, scent was never just physical. It carried memory, intention, and some believed divine permission. Some perfumes were even tied to moments of grief. When a beloved scholar died, his manuscripts would be anointed with bitter aloe or crushed kola nut paste, their sharp scents marking them as relics of mourning. Visitors would approach such manuscripts with solemnity, tracing the text with fingertips and inhaling slowly, like breathing in the presence of the departed. In a sense, it was an early form of olfactory memorial. A gravestone made not of stone, but of scent and script. And occasionally, scent was used to obscure. Think of it. A scholar facing persecution hides his more controversial texts in a stack of mundane law treatises. To throw off suspicious noses, he perfumes the stack with overpowering scents, dense layers of camphor, sulfur, and clove, masking any distinct fragrance that might reveal the true identity of the hidden gem beneath. A literary cloak and dagger move, executed with nothing but a mortar, pestle, and a sharp nose. There's one manuscript, now so fragile it can only be viewed through digital scans, that has what appears to be a thumbprint smudge of scented oil right across a key theological passage. Some say it's from a reader who read the line and, overwhelmed with emotion, touched the page with fingers still slick from anointing their forehead. Others say it was a deliberate act, anointing the word itself. No one knows for sure. But the smudge remains, a fragrant question mark, left behind for future minds to ponder. In many ways, the act of perfuming a manuscript was a promise that someone cared enough about its survival to scent its journey. That knowledge, once written, would not merely sit silently, but arrive like a whisper on the breeze, scented and alive, asking to be remembered. You lie there now, thinking how rarely we engage all 5 senses with our learning anymore. How much we've tucked away into glowing screens and sterile textbooks. But once, under the rustling palms and wide blue skies of medieval Africa, people inhaled their learning. They blended words with roots and prayers with petals. So yes, medieval African manuscripts smell slightly of perfume, but what they really smell like is intention. A time when knowledge was nurtured like a garden. A world where wisdom wasn't downloaded but distilled, slowly, reverently, and with the patience of someone steeping tea in the shade of a mango tree. You linger in that mango-scented shade a little longer, letting your breath match the rhythm of the leaves rustling overhead. But before you can drift too far, something stirs the dust beside you. A rustle of robes, a soft jingle of brass bangles, and suddenly you're walking beside someone you might not have expected. A woman, a scholar, and not just any scholar, but a known copyist, translator, and teacher, someone whose scent, if you leaned in close enough, would probably carry traces of lemongrass, ink, and confidence. Her name isn't recorded in any textbook you've read, but her work breathes through dozens of surviving manuscripts, hidden in the careful bends of diacritical marks and the scent trails of carefully dabbed perfume. Because here's the truth, women were present, not just as listeners or scribes' daughters who cleaned the ink pots. They were participants, leaders, preservers of knowledge, and many of them left their mark not just in margins, but in musky clove-scented pages that whispered of their unseen hands. Historians still argue whether women in Timbuktu had formal roles as professors, or if their teaching happened more quietly, in homes, gardens, and courtyards. But what's not debated is their presence in the oral networks, the preservation of texts, and the subtle transmission of wisdom through generations. It's like scent itself, sometimes invisible, always unmistakable. You follow one such woman now through a narrow alley, her robe trailing lightly in the dust, and she leads you into a small shaded room stacked wall to wall with scrolls and leather-bound volumes. The smell here is sharper, spicier, like dried ginger and black pepper, not aggressive, just alert. This is her collection, passed down from her mother and her mother's mother. Here, manuscripts aren't just written, they're remembered, recited out loud at dusk, with a bowl of incense smoldering in the corner, and students listening with faces lit by firelight, and the occasional sleepy yawn. Some of these manuscripts have delicate fabric bookmarks, stitched from strips of old dresses. Others have faint fingerprints in places where someone must have paused mid-reading, leaned their head on their hand, and let a drop of perfumed oil trickle from their temple. And yes, some have notations in what modern scholars eventually identified as distinctly feminine script styles. Slightly slanted, tightly looped, with decorative curls on certain consonants. One particularly charming discovery was a recipe for herbal ink written in the margin of a legal tract, completely off-topic, but clearly too precious not to record. Like leaving a cookie recipe on the back of a tax form. And oh, the ink recipes. You pause beside a manuscript open to a page that's more scent than script now. The words are nearly faded, but the smell, rosewood and cardamom, lingers, even after centuries. You imagine the woman who mixed it, crushing petals between stones, testing the mixture on scraps, adjusting ratios until she got the perfect balance of color, longevity, and olfactory shimmer. Because that was part of the mastery. It wasn't just about making a legible mark. It was about making a lasting one, a legacy that survived heat, termites, time, and forgetfulness. Scent, in this case, was insurance, and art, and affection. In some family libraries, scent served as a code. Certain perfumes denoted certain genres. A whiff of orange blossom might mean poetry. Musky sandalwood, likely a theological commentary. Faint peppermint, possibly a medical treatise or something you didn't want to fall asleep reading unless you wanted dreams of leeches and heated needles. It was a kind of subconscious filing system, designed less for efficiency and more for sensory memory. You didn't just remember what the book said, you remembered how it smelled. That kind of memory sticks, like the way your grandmother's closet smells like old rain and jasmine, even though she passed 5 years ago. One story, half history, half legend, tells of a manuscript library where the female head librarian would perfume the books differently each season. Citrus in spring, clove and cinnamon in winter, so even if a student couldn't read, they could smell the changing of intellectual seasons. Historians still debate whether this was real practice or just a romantic flourish layered into oral tradition. But then again, that's the thing about scent, its memory lingers even when the facts get fuzzy. And don't forget the children. Not every manuscript was for scholars in robes or merchants in turbans. Some were primers for children, simple texts, light on ink but heavy on fragrance. Why? Because kids remember smells better than scripts. A teacher might rub a manuscript with lavender before a lesson on moral virtues, or dab a bit of eucalyptus oil onto the corner of a math text to help alertness. Though no promises on how well that worked, some things never change. One anecdote describes a mother perfuming her son's study scroll with a blend of honey and ginger oil, saying, "Let the sweetness of learning stay in your bones." Honestly, you might steal that line someday. Back in the manuscript room, your guide lifts a scroll and presses it gently to your hands. The scent is subtle, not floral, not spicy, more like the cool breath of a darkened library, earthy, steady, wise. You feel something ripple beneath your fingertips. Not supernatural, just deeply human. The knowledge that someone, many someones, poured their time, their plant lore, their hopes and hand oils and prayers into this. And somehow, hundreds of years later, it reached you. Still scented, still alive. You walk out slowly, dazed, blinking against the sun. In your mind, the image of that woman's manuscript garden lingers, its pages humming with old ink, crushed petals, and the weightless, persistent power of smell. It stays with you, not as a fact to recite, but as a feeling to follow, like a trail of perfume leading you through history's winding corridors, reminding you that scent isn't an afterthought. It's a memory machine, a whisper that refuses to be forgotten. You follow that whisper like a thread of incense smoke through a shifting desert wind, drawn onward not by the promise of answers, but by the delicious ambiguity of it all. Because here's the thing, every manuscript you've touched so far, every corner of old parchment that's crinkled under your fingers, carries not just text and scent, but ritual. And now you find yourself at the heart of one. You've wandered into a courtyard bathed in the deep blue of pre-dawn. A few lanterns flicker. The air smells like ash and myrrh. And in the center, a group of scholars sits cross-legged around what looks like an ordinary book, but is clearly anything but ordinary. They are an intergenerational mix, some with beards dusted in gray, others barely old enough to remember the last big market day. And in the middle of them, nestled like a holy ember, is a manuscript being read aloud. The smell, a blend of frankincense, polished leather, and some oil you can't quite place, maybe neroli or something rarer. As the text is spoken, slowly, reverently, someone else fans a burner of smoking herbs beside it, letting the scent spiral and mingle with the syllables. You realize the perfume isn't background here. It's not for pleasure. It's part of the ceremony. This isn't just about preserving a manuscript's contents, it's about activating them. Letting the scent serve as mnemonic aid, as spiritual alignment, as a signal to the senses that this moment matters. That these words are not for idle scrolling or bedtime skimming. They are sacred in the broadest sense, not necessarily religious, but consecrated by intention. The scent sharpens that focus, draws memory tighter, anchors the body so the mind can move more freely. And you wonder, when you listen to podcasts with your favorite scented candle burning, are you too creating a kind of minor ritual? Historians still argue whether this olfactory practice was widespread or limited to certain mystical orders. But standing here now, with your own breath sinking to the rhythm of the incense curls, it feels fundamental. One scholar gently sprinkles a few drops of perfumed oil onto the manuscript binding. The gesture is so careful, you'd think he was feeding a sleeping child. And maybe, in a way, he is. Because a book like this doesn't just live in its words, it lives in the hands and scents and moments shared around it. The oil used, likely a blend inherited through generations, 1 part clove, 1 part musk root, 2 parts family secret. Some recipes were so closely guarded that they were passed down orally, never written, never sold. If you knew, you knew. If not, good luck. These oils weren't just used to honor the texts, they were also preservatives. Natural fixatives, keeping insects at bay, repelling mold, and protecting pages from the slow decay of desert air and human skin. And here's a fun bit. Certain oils, like camphor or vetiver, also acted as gentle deterrents for book thieves, not because they were harmful, but because their presence was so recognizable. Steal a perfumed manuscript, and everyone would know exactly where it came from the moment you cracked it open. Scent became signature, a quiet form of anti-theft technology that smelled like accountability. You take a seat at the edge of the gathering, letting the story being read seep into your ears even though you don't understand all the words. It's a tale of a great journey, one part fact, one part metaphor, as all the best stories are. And as the narrator's voice deepens, you catch a faint shift in the air. A second burner is lit. This one smells of dried lime and fig bark. The change in scent marks a turning point in the tale, just like a movie soundtrack swelling before the plot twist. Only here, the music is olfactory, and you don't just hear it, you breathe it. One of the younger scholars catches your eye and smiles, like he knows exactly what's happening in your brain right now. That rush of senses, that realization that stories, especially sacred ones, have always lived in more than ink. They've lived in voice, in time, in place, and yes, in smell. The young man reaches over and shows you a tiny bottle, worn glass, label-less mysterious. You tilt it gently under your nose. A rush of saffron and orange peel floods your senses. For a moment, the world dims, quiets, and when it returns, it feels different. More grounded, more awake. You learn, over whispered conversation, that this particular blend is reserved for texts related to dreams and interpretation. Supposedly, it helps open the reader to symbolic understanding, nudging the mind into a liminal state between wakefulness and sleep. You resist the urge to laugh too loudly anyway, because now you're thinking of how certain books you own, hello, high school chemistry, also opened a gateway to unconsciousness. But the point stands. These scholars understood something that modern science is only starting to document in neuroimaging labs. That smell is a key to memory, emotion, cognition. That rituals involving scent can alter how deeply we process information. And suddenly, you're thinking about how many rituals in your own life involve scent, even if you've never labeled them as such. Coffee in the morning, shampoo that smells like coconut nostalgia, the faint cologne left on your favorite sweater by someone you used to love. And you realize, smell isn't decorative, it's declarative. It says something about where you are, who you're with, what matters. That's the lesson echoing in this desert courtyard, older than any scroll, yet still as fresh as a lemon blossom in spring. As the reading draws to a close, someone gently closes the manuscript, pressing both palms against it as if to thank it. A final wisp of scented smoke trails into the air like a curtain falling on a play. No applause, just silence. Reverent, sleepy, rich with the smell of story. You rise, bow slightly, and step away from the circle. And as you do, you realize something odd. The manuscript smell is clinging to your clothes now, your hair, your very breath, like a memory that doesn't want to be forgotten, like a secret that's chosen you to carry it forward. And as you step out into the slowly brightening dawn, the first light kissing the sand, you hear someone murmur behind you, "The scent will remind you before the words do." And it's true, because long after the syllables fade and the pages crumble, scent lingers. Invisible, persistent, and impossibly alive. You walk through that dawn like someone freshly anointed. Every step you take seems steeped in something unseen, a kind of aromatic afterglow that the sun hasn't yet dared to dissolve. And no, you're not hallucinating. It's real, it's faint, but there. That warm blend of clove and citrus, of cedar oil and old parchment, of time itself distilled somehow. You've just left a ritual, but what you don't realize yet is that you've stepped straight into another one written in footpaths and sky colors, in smells that whisper through alleyways rather than proclamations carved in stone. This new scent trail leads you, unintentionally of course, to the very edge of the manuscript quarter, where ink meets industry. There, tucked beneath canopies of woven palm and canvas, are the perfumers. not modern chemists in lab coats, no. These are artisan blenders, alchemists of mood, memory, and manuscript preservation. They work not just with oils and resins, but with intention. Their stalls aren't flashy, most don't even have signs, but you'll know you've arrived when the air changes. One moment the wind smells of date, paste, and dust, and the next it hits you. Layers of sandalwood, a bite of myrrh, a sweetness just beneath, like someone warmed honey over coals. These perfumers are part of the reason ancient manuscripts survived long enough for you to even smell them today. They were the invisible architects of longevity. Their recipes were rarely written, their shops rarely passed to strangers. You watch a woman in her 50s grind dried petals into a stone bowl with practiced elegance. Next to her, a teenage boy stirs a mixture of something syrupy in a copper pan over a low flame. You notice his hands aren't stained with ink, like the scribes, but slick with something darker, like history filtered through spice and sap. His job, you learn, is to make the binder's breath, a sweet, tacky substance smeared along leather bindings to keep bugs out and moisture balanced. And it smells like the inside of a cedar chest married a vanilla orchard. It's glorious. You strike up conversation and he tells you that the trick isn't just the ingredients, it's the rhythm, the timing, the temperature of the day, and the kind of wood your tools are made of. He says, you can't rush an oil meant for eternity. And sure, maybe it's just something his grandmother used to say, but doesn't it stick with you? Doesn't it sound like the kind of wisdom we forget too easily now, in a world of express shipping and digital memory? You ask him which scents go into manuscript oils specifically, and he just smiles like you've asked how to forge a king's seal. But then his grandmother, the master perfumer herself, gestures you closer and offers a whiff of something from a ceramic jar wrapped in leather string. You lean in, not knowing what to expect, and your brain just quiets. It smells like an old forest wrapped in gold leaf. A little bitter, a little sweet, very much alive. She tells you it's based on an old Nubian blend, passed down by word of mouth for at least 12 generations. A mix of wild fennel, crushed orchid root, resin tapped only at sunrise, and something she calls the breath of shadow. Likely a poetic name for musk aged in clay for a decade. Whatever it is, it feels like smelling a memory you haven't lived yet. Historians still argue whether these manuscript perfumes were reserved for special books, like Qurans or legal scrolls, or if they were used more casually in day-to-day learning centers. Some believe they were only used once a manuscript was complete, sealing it with scent like a wax stamp of honor. Others argue that the scent was applied all throughout its life cycle, from the stretching of parchment to the final decorative flourish. No one really agrees, and no one really knows, which, let's face it, makes the whole thing even more delightful. As you wander deeper into the perfumer's alley, you see variations of this knowledge everywhere. One stall focuses on cool blends, oils that protect against mildew and insects during the rainy season. Another sells only hot oils, designed to preserve manuscripts in dry, arid climates. Some blends even change with the liturgical calendar, infused with specific smells thought to align with sacred times. It's like manuscript aromatherapy crossed with lunar gardening. You can't help but wonder what your own calendar would smell like. Monday, burnt toast and ambition. Friday, cinnamon hope with a spritz of escape. Then you meet a man who introduces himself as a scroll whisperer. You want to laugh, but he's dead serious. His job, he says, is to wake the scent in old books. He explains that over time, oils can sink too deeply into the paper or leather, hiding beneath layers of dust or temperature shifts. He uses gentle heat, breath, and sometimes sound to coax the scent back to the surface. A heat lamp warmed by the sun, a soft reed flute playing nearby, and occasionally a few drops of goat milk to wake the spice. You ask him if it works, and he raises one eyebrow before holding a manuscript to your nose. You catch clove, then cardamom, then something that smells like aged wood carried across oceans. You nod, and he just says, "She remembers now." Not at she, the book as a living thing, and that's when it hits you. This entire culture, this manuscript ecosystem, doesn't treat books like inert containers. They're living vessels. They grow, they sleep, they remember. They are cared for like people and preserved like temples. And scent is their heartbeat, their aura, their unspoken language that lingers even when the ink fades and the script becomes unreadable. It's the thing you smell and know deep down that someone somewhere loved this object enough to make it fragrant, to make it endure. So now, even when you touch your own modern books, crisp paperbacks, overworked hardcovers, screenlit PDFs, you start to notice what's missing. Not just the oils, but the care, the sensory ceremony, the love etched not just in letters but in the air around them. You imagine what it would be like if your favorite childhood book still smelled like lavender from your grandmother's garden, or if your wedding vows carried the scent of the flowers you held that day, or if your father's notebook still whispered the scent of his cologne every time you cracked it open. And you understand now, truly, why those medieval African manuscripts smell faintly of perfume. It wasn't vanity, it was devotion, a way to link mind to memory, text to time, reader to page to past, one deep breath at a time. You leave the perfumer's alley a little stunned, like you've just smelled the soul of a civilization, and it nodded back in recognition. Your mind is still swimming with the layers, how scent, craft, time, and memory have blended into a single inhale. But before you can overthink it, a breeze carries something new. Not sharp like clove or grounded like cedar. No, this one is gentler, sweeter, almost fruity, with a hint of rose water and beeswax. You follow it because, by now, you've learned to trust where the air is leading you, and it brings you straight to the women's courtyard. You didn't expect this part of the journey, but here you are. A sunlit square framed with faded awnings and laughter that comes in waves. There's a slow rhythm here. Mortars grinding, fingers plucking at delicate threads, whispers exchanged like petals tossed into the wind. And at the center, scrolls, wrapped, stacked, embroidered, and glowing faintly under the afternoon light. Not a library, not exactly. This is more like a sanctuary for wisdom in waiting. And the custodians, grandmothers, aunties, young girls learning the weight of paper the way others might learn to hold a newborn lamb. You notice immediately that these manuscripts aren't stored like relics. They're handled, braided into daily life. A woman reading aloud while weaving. A girl copying a passage while another spritzes her fingertips with a tiny cloth soaked in rose water. You watch, curious, and she grins. For the pages, she says, so they stay soft, like skin. And you want to cry at how obvious and beautiful that is. The scent here is different because the process is different. These are not the large, illuminated legal tomes or Quranic compilations from the scriptoria. These are personal books, books of recipes, of herbal remedies, of poems passed down and reshaped with each generation. And they don't just smell of preservation, they smell of belonging. Imagine a manuscript steeped in the same rose water used to bathe a newborn. Pages kissed by oils meant for wedding day wrists. Ink lines corrected with fingers still sticky from date syrup. These aren't artifacts. They're family members. Historians still argue whether women had formal roles in manuscript production in medieval Africa or if their influence remained mostly in oral and domestic spheres. But here, in this courtyard, you feel no ambiguity. They were scribes, teachers, healers, poets, the kind who stitched prayers into fabric and verses into recipes. Ask one elder how long she's been tending these books, and she just laughs. I was born beside one, she says. The smell woke me before I opened my eyes. You believe her, there's one manuscript in particular that draws you in. Its cover is worn velvet, faded from royal purple to a color somewhere between plum and dust. A faint floral scent rises from it, not perfumed exactly, but lived in. You're given permission to touch it. Carefully, your fingers graze the edge, and you feel the smoothness that only comes from centuries of handling. Not neglect. Attention. It opens not with a creak but with a sigh, like it's happy to be noticed again. Inside are herbal recipes, mixtures of camphor and ash for fevers, pomegranate rind with honey for throat aches, but what stuns you most isn't the remedies, it's the marginalia. Tiny notes scribbled in the corners, some prayers, some updates, some scent reminders. Add rose oil if for a child one reads. Cinnamon better in winter, another says. These notes aren't just medical, they're poetic. Evidence of a kind of intimacy with the body and the page that our world rarely makes space for anymore. A girl shows you how they test their perfumes and ointments. Not on skin, but on dried parchment scraps. Paper remembers, she tells you, holding a strip of treated leather close to your face. It smells faintly of marula and ash. She places it beside another, a blend with frankincense and lemongrass. You can smell the difference immediately, but she goes deeper. Explains how one blend repels moths, another soothes eye strain, another preserves ink better during humid months. These aren't cosmetic touches. They're functional scent technology centuries ahead of its time, and somehow in the middle of this lesson you're handed a scroll. Delicate, wrapped in embroidered linen and tied with a small braid of human hair. It smells like lavender and lemon and something you can't quite name. The woman who offers it to you doesn't speak. She just nods once and gestures for you to open it. You do. Inside are lullabies, handwritten in a script that loops like wind over sand, and suddenly it makes sense. Of course lullabies were written, preserved, perfumed. Of course scent would be the thread that tied sound to sleep, mother to child, page to palm. You sit there longer than you meant to, watching generations drift through that courtyard like the scent itself, quiet, consistent, absolutely essential. There's no rush here, no clickbait or algorithm, just human knowledge, perfumed and passed hand to hand. And now you're part of it too. As you rise to leave, an elder presses something into your hand. A tiny sachet of dried petals and bark wrapped in linen. For your books, she says, so they'll remember where you've been. You thank her, heart a little swollen. And as you step back into the sun, you realize you will tuck this sachet between your own pages. You'll scent your notebooks, your margins, your memories, not for anyone else, just so the future smells like something worth remembering. And just like that, you understand why the manuscripts smell sweet. They don't just carry knowledge, they carry people. And people, as it turns out, leave more than fingerprints. You carry the sachet with both reverence and a slightly goofy grin, as if someone just handed you the key to a door only you can see. And maybe they did. Because now, every breeze feels like a whisper, every papery crackle underfoot could be a chapter turning in the library of the world. You follow the scent trail again, not forward but upward, into a building of clay and timber that doesn't shout for attention but hums like a tuning fork hit gently at dusk. The air changes instantly when you enter. Cooler, thicker with shadow and smoke. The windows are high and narrow, filtering in beams of light like floating silk ribbons. At first glance, you think you're alone, but then you notice him, an old man, cross-legged, nibbling on something that looks suspiciously like a fig but might actually be a date stuffed with clove. He nods at you, doesn't speak, but his eyes sparkle like he already knows what you're here for. You don't need to ask questions. He gestures to the walls and suddenly you see it. Shelves lined with manuscripts. Tall, thin, squat, boxy. Every shape imaginable and all wearing time like an old cape. This is no casual reading room. This is a preservation chamber. But unlike the sterile, humidity-controlled vaults of modern archives, this room breathes. It breathes in dust and memory and exhales stories softened by spice and oil. The scent here is heavier than in the women's courtyard, less floral, more musky. Frankincense clings to the wood. Musk trails off the edges of papyrus sheets, and somewhere beneath it all is a note of leather, warm, worn, like the palm of someone who's held a lot of hands and secrets. You ask about the preservation process, and the man finally speaks, voice like gravel dipped in honey. We don't just protect the books, he says, we feed them. And before you can raise an eyebrow, he's explaining how every manuscript is treated not with chemicals but with mixtures of oils, spices, and smoke. How scent is not decoration, it's defense. Against mold, against insects, against time itself. Historians still argue whether such practices emerged from necessity or if they were inherited from trade partners across the Indian Ocean and the Maghreb. But in this room, the argument feels irrelevant. The method works, that's enough. He shows you a long, thin scroll sealed at the edges with beeswax. He cracks it open like a fortune cookie, and the scent escapes like breath held in for centuries. Cardamom, charcoal, a ghost of something sweet, possibly fig leaf. The manuscript inside is crisp, untouched by the centuries that have devoured other texts less fortunate. We seal the past in its own perfume, he says, that way it remembers itself. He brings you to a corner where strips of parchment hang from a wooden lattice, each one infused with a different preservation oil. Test papers, he calls them, like paint swatches but for scent. You lean in, and it's a garden party for the senses. One smells like citrus rinds, crushed underfoot in a spice market. Another like sandalwood left too long in the sun. A third has the sharpness of camphor but softens into something almost minty. Each note tells a story not just of what it protects, but who mixed it. When, why, and suddenly you're deep in the discussion of scent layering, how multiple notes were intentionally used to confuse or deter specific insects. Bitter on the outside, sweet inside, or how rose might mask the vinegar of a drying agent. These aren't just recipes, they're olfactory code. A chemical symphony that makes mold spores cry uncle and sends bookworms running. You're in awe again. You spot a thick ledger resting on a carved pedestal, almost like it's in timeout. Turns out it's the scent registry. A centuries-old log of which mixtures were used, where, when, and, sometimes, on what kind of manuscript. It's meticulous. Pages filled with lines like, Blend 3B used on genealogical scrolls from Gao, week before rainy season, or cache a heavy mixture not effective on camel skin parchments. See Incident with Beetle Infestation, 1743. You stifle a laugh, but the scribe doesn't. He nods solemnly. The Beatles were ambitious. There's humor here and grief and pride. And every emotion we try to keep tidy in footnotes and cataloging systems. But manuscripts don't play by those rules. They soak it all up. You realize now that scent is the most honest footnote of all. It lingers even when the ink fades. It tells you what's been hidden, handled, mourned, celebrated. You're shown one last scroll before you go. It's encased in what looks like an old jewelry box but smells like a tiny temple. The top is lined with cinnamon bark. The bottom with what the old man calls inkstone tears, crystallized residue from burned incense and crushed pigment. The manuscript inside, a ledger of trades between a coastal family and their partners in Yemen, dated over 600 years ago. You breathe it in and nearly choke. It smells like the ocean and firewood and something citrusy. Maybe dried orange peels, maybe longing, hard to tell. Before you leave, the old man gives you a pouch of the dust blend used to freshen manuscript shelves. For your clothes drawer, he suggests, though you know you'll never use it, not for that. This belongs with the sachet from the courtyard, a new kind of archive forming in your own pocket. And just as you're about to step out, he adds one more thing. Don't forget, he says, scent is a kind of ink. It just writes on the air. You nod. Heart swollen with gratitude and your shirt slightly dustier than it was this morning. And as you step back into the late afternoon sun, the wind seems to carry that truth right past your ear like a whispered P.S. from the past. You walk down the steps again, slower this time, as if each one might play a note in the quiet chord of memory this place is stitching together. The sachet from the women's courtyard and the dust blend from the preservation chamber now rest together in your pocket like strange, aromatic cousins, unspoken promises tied in scent instead of ink. The air outside feels warmer, or maybe it's you. Maybe you're carrying too much history now, warm and breathing, and clinging to the folds of your clothes like wood smoke after a campfire. You turn a corner and stumble into something unexpected. A garden tucked behind a high wall, hidden like a forgotten verse. At first, it seems simple enough. A few flowering bushes, a date tree in the middle, some herbs growing near a clay water channel. But then you smell it. Not the garden itself, but the books that line the small pavilion at the edge of it. Yes, more manuscripts. Sitting open in the shade like sunbathers who gave up and went for the umbrella. Only these ones are different. These aren't theological treatises or dynastic records. They're recipes, medicine journals, aromatic experiments. One parchment, nearly translucent with age, lists methods for perfuming cloth before a wedding. Another has a diagram, yes, a hand-drawn diagram, of a distillation device using a goatskin pouch and a series of earthen jars. And you realize, right there under the soft hum of bees, that you've just walked into a medieval fragrance lab. An olfactory think tank centuries before modern chemistry wore a lab coat. A woman sits at the far end, her hands busy grinding dried blossoms in a shallow stone bowl. She nods toward you like she's been expecting you all along. You sit nearby, careful not to disturb the curling paper leaves scattered on the low table between you. She's humming, a tune that seems older than language and twice as comforting. Without speaking, she picks up a second bowl and hands it to you, nodding at a pile of dried myrrh bark. You begin grinding too, slowly, rhythmically, like the act itself is prayer or memory or both. As the dust rises, you understand that this is where the scent started. Not with the manuscripts themselves, but with the science behind them. Historians still argue whether these gardens were private apothecaries or part of an academic tradition linked to broader Islamic science networks. What's clear, though, is that people here didn't just use perfume to smell good, they used it to code reality, to map moods, to mark transitions, birth, marriage, death, to cleanse, to bless, to diagnose, to protect. You glance at a notebook labeled in a looping hand and your eyes catch a phrase. Sweet basil for clarity of thought, bitter almond oil to honor the dead. Another line reads, rosewater prevents despair from rooting in the chest, apply before sleep. It reads like a recipe and a poem and a lullaby all at once. You have to blink twice to keep reading. The woman points to a roll of parchment, half unfurled. On it is a matrix, rows and columns tracking which scents were used in which manuscripts depending on purpose. Manuscripts intended for legal disputes, infused with citrus and ash, those meant for poetry, sandalwood and rose, sometimes jasmine if available, texts of healing or prophecy, musk and mint paired with cooling agents like camphor. These aren't just flavor profiles, they're emotional maps. She finally speaks, her voice steady, with a bit of wind in it. They knew scent had memory, they used it to help the words remember themselves. You want to write that down, you want to tattoo it on your brain, but you just keep grinding myrrh because some truths are meant to be absorbed by the body first. A boy runs past, barefoot and laughing, and the woman waves him off with mock impatience. He's looking for beeswax, she says, thinks it will make his ink waterproof. You both laugh, but she's not joking. She tells you about a time they mixed clove oil with black dye for writing, just to see if it would deter bugs. It worked, sort of. The ink stayed, but it also made every page smell like a winter market. Apparently the legal clerks complained. Too festive for divorce proceedings, one wrote in the margins. You turn over a stack of loose parchment and find something you didn't expect, a recipe for scenting parchment itself. Not the ink, not the oil used for preservation, but the very surface of the paper. It calls for rosewater, dried neroli peel, and a splash of vinegar to open the pores of the hide. The woman shrugs. Makes it feel alive again, she says. And you swear the parchment beneath your fingers pulses just slightly, like a memory flexing its muscle after a long sleep. You look around the garden one more time, now fully aware that this isn't just a fragrance lab, it's a language, one spoken in oils and petals and ash. A system of meaning where every scent is a syllable, where lavender means forgiveness, where musk means truth held close, where lemon balm means I wrote this thinking of you. She hands you a tiny cloth sachet as you rise to leave. It smells like crushed leaves and honey and maybe something herbal you can't quite place. You'll know when to use it, she says, and somehow you believe her. As you leave, your hand brushes the shoulder of a vine and you catch its scent, green, bright, fleeting, like the last page of a story that didn't want to end but had to. And in that moment, you realize something. The manuscripts don't smell of perfume because they were scented. They smell like perfume because they were lived, handled, believed in, written with conviction and stored with care and stitched together with the same hands that anointed skin and prepared bodies for burial and wiped away tears with cloth that held the scent of safety. The manuscripts smell of life. And life, it turns out, is made of many things, but mostly quietly, fiercely, of memory and scent. You pass through a narrow, arched doorway that wasn't there yesterday, or maybe it was, but your eyes weren't ready for it yet. The wall around it is faded blue, chipped in places, like time tried to peel it back layer by layer. As you step through, you enter a small, circular room, lit only by the soft shimmer of sunlight filtering through hanging threads of fabric dyed in oranges, golds, and deep desert reds. They sway gently in the breeze, brushing your shoulders like curious ghosts. And there, on a single raised platform in the middle of the room, sits a manuscript unlike the others. Bound not in leather but in embroidered cloth, stitched with tiny pearls and what looks like crushed saffron-dyed thread. It doesn't smell like perfume. Not quite. It smells like waiting. You circle the manuscript slowly, like it might move if you look too fast. The cloth crackles softly as you touch it, and underneath, the scent rises. A faint whisper of vetiver, maybe, and something else. Something sharp, like dried lime rind left in the sun too long. You open the cover with both hands. The script inside is unmistakably Arabic, but the calligraphy spirals, almost dances across the page like someone letting their thoughts unravel through movement. It's not neat, not academic, not formulaic, it feels human. Raw, honest. This is a diary, or maybe something like it. A personal chronicle, written by someone with ink-stained fingers and a stubborn heart. The first line reads, "If I perfume this page, it is only so my soul will remember the moment it was written." And just like that, you're in. Eyes tracing each word. Breath syncing with the cadence of a person long gone, yet somehow still here. The entries alternate between poetic musings, herbal concoction notes, dreams, and descriptions of conversations with people who may or may not have existed. It's a mess. It's beautiful. One page details a recipe to calm the chest on nights of shadow thoughts. It lists chamomile steeped in clove vapor, with lavender oil rubbed on the temples, and a prayer whispered into the folds of the pillowcase. Another page jumps erratically into a reflection on loneliness during the fasting month, scented with crushed tangerine peel to mock the sweetness I pretend not to crave. This isn't a book written for history. It's written for survival. Historians still argue whether this manuscript belongs to a known Sufi mystic or a lesser-known herbalist in the Gao region. Some claim it's part of a larger anthology of inner scrolls, meant only for the self. Others believe it was a training manual for spiritual apprentices, masked as a diary so it could be passed from hand to hand without scrutiny. Either way, it's perfume-soaked not because it needed to be preserved, but because the writer couldn't bear to smell only ink and parchment when writing about love, longing, or death. You flip to a section where the page edges have darkened slightly, maybe from oils, maybe from time. The writing here is sharper, more urgent. Today I dreamed of drowning in a library where every book bled rosewater. You pause. You can almost smell that nightmare, sweet and terrifying. The writer goes on to describe a remedy for bad dreams, sleeping with a sprig of mint in one hand and a sliver of frankincense under the tongue. It will not stop the dreams they write, but it may let you speak their language. You lean back and let that sink in. Speak the language of dreams. That's what these manuscripts were doing all along, wasn't it? They weren't just repositories of facts, they were sensorial spells. Knowledge, yes, but cloaked in incense and dust, grounded in the tactility of touch and taste and breath. That's why they endure. Not because of their content alone, but because of how they were lived through every one of the senses. You stand and the threads sway around you again. The scent clings to your skin now, a lingering trace of this writer's heart, their fears, their strange night rituals. You wonder how many people like this existed, people who wrote only to process, not to publish, whose pages were dipped in perfume not to impress but to comfort themselves as they wrote hard things, who sat awake at night grinding myrrh while confessing secrets to the page. As you exit the circular room, you realize something else. The cloth that covered the manuscript wasn't just decorative, it was protective. Scented cloth was believed to be sacred. It warded off insects, yes, but also malaise. Also misfortune. There's even a belief, scribbled in one marginal note in a different manuscript, that a book wrapped in fragrant cloth becomes unreadable to evil spirits. You chuckle softly. Imagine a frustrated demon trying to get through a lavender-scented text, only to give up halfway because the vibes are just too peaceful. Your steps carry you down a shaded corridor with murals that echo the themes of scent and silence. A painted woman pours oil into a lamp with one hand and holds a quill in the other. A child presses herbs between two stones while looking up at a cluster of stars. Each mural has that faint golden dust over it, the same powder used to bind incense cones. You touch the wall and some of it transfers to your fingers. It smells faintly of marigold and camphor, like memory that refuses to die. You think about modern archives now, climate-controlled, sterile, precisely catalogued. Efficient, yes, but lacking that weird, tender human excess that medieval African manuscripts poured into every fiber. You imagine a researcher centuries from now, opening a preserved hard drive and frowning at the lack of aroma. What kind of culture, they'll whisper, stores memory without perfume? It's then you remember the sachet the garden woman gave you. You take it out and press it to your nose. That same crushed leaf, honeyed scent, still mysterious, still warm. You slip it back into your pocket like a secret you're not ready to open yet. Some things deserve to unfold on their own time. As the corridor opens into a new room, you feel lighter somehow. Not in the way that suggests loss, but in the way you feel after exhaling something you didn't realize you were holding. And you wonder, did the people who wrote these pages feel that too? That lift in the chest as ink met paper, as rosewater met skin, as sandalwood settled into the corners of thought. You hope so, because you feel it now. And it smells like something you never want to forget. The hallway widens, and the light shifts again, this time to a dusky mauve that casts soft, sleepy shadows on the walls. You follow them like they know the way, and maybe they do. You've wandered long enough now to stop pretending you're in control. The scent changes too, less floral, more woody, like the inside of an old cedar chest left open just enough to whisper its secrets into the room. A hush falls, thicker than silence. You step barefoot now, though. You don't remember losing your shoes. Here, in this room, it isn't manuscripts that line the shelves, it's bottles. Rows and rows of tiny, corked, stained, hand-blown bottles. Some clouded over with time, others still clear enough to see golden liquid shimmering inside. The labels are curled and cracked, handwritten with care, sometimes just a symbol, sometimes a name. One bottle has a star drawn beside a crescent moon, another simply says "for grief." You instinctively reach for one that reads "ink of the palm heart." It's warm to the touch, not warm like the sun, warm like breath against your wrist. You uncork it carefully, and the scent rises instantly, lush, earthy, faintly sweet. It smells like rain-soaked bark and crushed fig. Suddenly, without needing to read a thing, you know it was meant to anoint the hands of scribes, not because they were holy, but because the writing ritual was. Before the pen touched parchment, the fingers had to carry intention. Scent was part of that preparation. A grounding, a focus, maybe even a protection. Historians still argue whether scent anointing was symbolic or practical. But here, in this amber-scented quiet, the debate feels irrelevant. You know what you feel, and it's reverence. On a central table round and worn with carvings of vines, you see a set of scrolls wrapped in silken strips, each one accompanied by a small bottle sealed with wax. The scrolls are thinner than manuscripts, their pages soft like pressed leaves. You unwrap one. The first line reads, "To write is to distill the invisible." You sigh, of course it is. The scroll seems to chart the process of fragrant illumination, a method used by select scribes to pair ink with scent. Not perfuming after the fact, but blending scented oils directly into the ink itself. A recipe follows: powdered charcoal, gum arabic, rose attar, and a single drop of something called lion's sleep, a euphemism for a particularly rare resin harvested during dry lightning storms. Real or metaphor, hard to say, but it sounds amazing and honestly you want some. Your fingers brush another bottle. This one is empty, but the label intrigues you. It reads, "Memory of the third voice." You pause, a soft joke, a spiritual reference, a forgotten love triangle. The scroll beside it clarifies nothing, just a poetic list. Smoke from cedar roots, ink pressed from apricot pits, rain harvested during eclipse. What was this scent for? Summoning dreams, calming arguments, making sense of grief that didn't have language yet. You wish you could smell it just once, just enough to know what the third voice sounds like. You spend a long while moving from bottle to bottle, scroll to scroll, each pairing more personal than the last. Some are clearly instructions. Others are full of margin notes in a script barely legible, frantic, excited, probably half asleep. One note reads, "Used too much jasmine, couldn't focus, saw my mother in a candle flame." Another, "Wrote this page with tears and vetiver, unsure which did more damage." These weren't just scent experiments. They were lived moments, alchemized into ink and memory. There's a bottle marked with a broken circle. No label, no scroll. You open it and the smell is so strange you freeze. It's sharp at first, like citrus rind burned slightly, but then it settles into something deeper. Almost musky, like petrichor and distant thunder. A fringe theory once claimed some manuscripts were infused with bodily scents, sweat, breath, even tears, as part of specific rituals. Most scholars scoffed at it. Too personal, too unhygienic, too speculative. But smelling this, you wonder, you really wonder. Some knowledge refuses to live only in words. It wants to live in skin, in salt, in ache. You sit down on a cushion that's embroidered with little stitch spirals. The floor is warm. The air smells like 20 forgotten lives waking up at once. You close your eyes and imagine someone else sitting here, centuries ago, mixing ink with rose and rue, dipping their reed pen, and whispering blessings into each line. Maybe they didn't know their writing would survive. Maybe they did. Maybe that's why they perfumed it, to make sure the scent could guide it home if the words ever got lost. A draft tickles your neck, and you follow it with your gaze. There's a window above, and through it you see a tree, just one, alone in a courtyard, a baobab maybe, or an old tamarind. At its base are stones arranged in a circle, and on each stone a small cloth bundle. From here you can't see what's inside them. But you know, of course you know, sachets, offerings, perfumed memory wrapped in silk, gifts to ancestors or muses or perhaps the future. One bundle flutters slightly and you imagine it whispering your name. You rise and stretch, fingers tingling from being still too long. You take one last bottle in your hand before leaving the room. No label, you don't open it, not yet, it's enough to know it's there. Like a question you're not quite ready to ask. As you step through the doorway, you realize something simple and astonishing. Scent doesn't just preserve, it anticipates. It prepares the page for a reader who might not arrive for centuries. It makes space for them, invites them in, and you've just been invited. You, night traveler, stepping lightly through the bones of the past, have been wrapped in something once meant for someone else. And it fits anyway, like scent always does, like a story waiting for your breath to wake it. The corridor curves again, not sharply, but like a path designed by water, slow, inevitable, carved by patient time rather than straight lines and rulers. You walk it quietly, holding your bottle with care, the unlabeled one. You still haven't opened it. Maybe you never will. Maybe that's the point. Some perfumes, like some stories, are meant to be carried, not consumed. The walls here are closer again, patterned with outlines of vines and calligraphy faded to shadows. You run your fingers along the edge, and it's warm. Not from sun, from memory. You arrive in what might be the oldest part of this dreaming archive. The stones underfoot feel worn into shape by centuries of slippers and sandaled feet. A low light pools around a single reading bench, draped with a wool cloth stitched with constellations. The bench faces a set of shelves built into the wall itself, stone nooks cradling manuscripts so fragile they seem to breathe with your exhale. And near them, small wooden drawers. One's been left open just a crack, and of course you open it further. Inside, tightly wrapped in waxed linen, is a bundle of herbs so ancient it should have crumbled, but doesn't. You lift it gently and inhale. Lavender, crushed cedar tips, a touch of mint, and something else, sweet and strange. Not quite vanilla, not quite resin. A perfume for the paper, not the person. A ward, maybe, or a whisper. You begin to understand now why so many African manuscripts smell the way they do. It's not that someone sprayed them recently with scent to preserve or romanticize them. It's that scent was part of the manuscript's making from the beginning. Not every time, no, not universally, but often enough that the trace remains. In pages that smell like rose and smoke. In bindings that carry hints of henna or nutmeg or clay. Historians still debate whether this was ritual, convenience, or purely aesthetic preference. Some argue it was just the smell of the spaces themselves, monasteries infused with incense and oil and earth. Others think it was more deliberate. You lean toward the latter. After all, accidents don't feel this precise, this intimate. A soft rustling turns your head. No one there, of course. But something draws your attention to a manuscript resting open on a pedestal nearby. The pages are uneven at the edge, hand-trimmed, imperfectly folded, and between two of them rests a dried petal. Deep crimson, curled at the edges, still faintly fragrant. You don't dare touch it. The scent is faint but present. Rose, yes, but aged, tinted with dust and wood smoke. Someone placed it there for a reason. Maybe it was the scribe. Maybe it was a reader long after. Maybe it was love or mourning or just the kind of mood that made you pick up a flower and say, yes, this belongs with these words. Another manuscript lies nearby. This one shut tight, bound in dyed goatskin the color of copper in twilight. Its strap is sealed with a wax imprint, cracked in places but still recognizable, a stylized bird in flight. You don't open it either. There's a reverence here you don't want to break. But beside it lies a scrap of paper and on it a fragment. The scent remains after the voice is gone. That hits you harder than expected. You sit for a moment, holding it in your palm like something fragile. You think of all the voices that wrote and read these pages, of the breath they used to speak these words, and how all of them, every last one, have gone silent. And yet here is scent. Still present. Still whispering. You walk slowly now, not from fatigue but from awe. Your eyes catch glimpses of marginal notes in languages you don't recognize. Symbols too, tiny suns, spiral swirls, birds with outstretched wings. You pass one cabinet of manuscripts entirely dedicated to medicinal texts, and the scent there changes again, sharper, greener, almost metallic. You read a line from one of the open pages. Crush the leaves before sunrise, mix with ink, speak the name aloud only once. You believe it without question, sometimes you just do. Farther along, you find a short shelf filled with children's learning texts. Not many, just a few carefully crafted primers full of diagrams and phonetic lessons. One page has tiny fingerprints in the corner. Another is decorated with simple images of birds and boats. You inhale, and the scent is shockingly sweet, like marzipan and orange blossom. You laugh softly. Of course, they perfume the children's manuscripts. Not always, but sometimes. Just enough to make the memory stick. Learning is more powerful when it tastes or smells like joy. That's not just neuroscience, that's human instinct. Then comes the last alcove, and it's not filled with manuscripts at all. Instead, it holds objects. Personal items from scribes, a chipped inkwell carved from bone, a stylus wrapped in silk thread, a pouch with dried cloves and crushed myrrh, a broken comb and a length of woven hair ribbon. You pause at a pair of sandals, the leather straps faintly scented still. Was this the footwear of someone who walked these halls centuries ago? Did they carry scent on their skin, their clothes, into every page they touched? Almost certainly. A manuscript is never just ink on paper. It's hands and breath and oil and memory. You turn toward the exit slowly. You feel changed. Not in a loud, movie montage way, but quietly. Like a door's open behind your ribs, you don't want to leave, but you're not really leaving. You're carrying the story with you now, and you're carrying scent. Maybe not one you can name or bottle, but it clings, it lingers, like all good stories. You feel it in your hands, at the edge of your sleeves. In your breath, you glance once more at the bottle in your palm, still unopened. You smile. Maybe it doesn't need to be. Maybe just knowing it exists is enough. Some stories work like that too. You walk the final stretch like someone returning from a dream. The floor smooths beneath your steps, and the scent changes again, subtly, less manuscript, more earth, less perfume, more breath. The corridor narrows, not with walls closing in, but with time catching up. You reach the last door, low and wooden, half covered in faded inscriptions and flakes of gold leaf. You place your hand against it and push, not forcefully, just enough to let the centuries sigh open. Beyond the door is a circular chamber. A dome curves overhead like the inside of a shell, painted in constellations that no longer match the night sky. This place feels like a pause in history. Not a tomb, not a temple, just a memory suspended in stone. In the center stands a wide pedestal with no manuscripts, no objects, just a wide ceramic bowl, glazed in blues and greens and etched with swirls. You step forward, drawn not by duty, but by curiosity. Inside the bowl is ash, pale, fine, and mixed with something darker, something granular. You lean in closer and breathe. The scent is impossible to describe. It's musk and honey, leather and linden, cloves and something almost marine. Something like memory before it becomes language. You close your eyes, and it feels like every manuscript you've passed has shed a part of itself into this bowl, like a slow-burning incense of lost centuries. Scholars debate whether bowls like these were for ritual purification or symbolic endings. Some say they were used to anoint scribes before long copying sessions. Others argue they were just ashtrays with a poetic afterlife. You suspect it's both. That truth is rarely neat. That maybe the bowl itself doesn't care what we think it was. You sit cross-legged beside it, suddenly exhausted but not weary. Just full. As if your whole body has been perfumed by story. You think about what these manuscripts meant to the people who made them, not just as texts, but as treasures, sacred not only because of their words, but because of the scent, the feel, the rhythm of copying, the hush of reading under moonlight, the care with which they were oiled and wrapped and hidden away. These books weren't relics. They were friends, they were home, and their perfume isn't accidental. You realize that now. This wasn't some quirk of climate or coincidence. It was intention. Pages rubbed with rosewater before ink touched them. Leather soaked in camphor before it became a cover. Shelves smudged with frankincense not to preserve, but to invite. The perfume was the threshold, the unspoken. Welcome, it said, you are entering a world made of care. And now you've walked that world. You think back to your own books, the ones on your shelf. The ones that smell of paper and glue and maybe coffee if they are lucky. You wonder what scent you'd choose to preserve your stories. What you'd lace into the spine so that someone centuries from now, leaning close, could inhale and feel you there. Not your facts, not your name, but your breath. Your rhythm, the mood of your silences. You imagine someone doing just that, and you smile. The room begins to dim, not suddenly, not unnaturally. Just the way twilight does when no one's looking. The bowl before you glows faintly in the last light, and its scent thickens, folds in on itself, becomes softer. You stand, stretch, breathe in one last time. Then you walk toward the thin passage that leads upward out of this sunken chamber of dreams. Your footsteps echo faintly. The air grows cooler. You pass murals you didn't notice on the way. In, scenes of scribes sitting beneath acacia trees, of camels walking under stars, of tiny painted fingers dipping brushes into inkwells shaped like shells. You pass a long-dead spiderweb stretched across a book cart, dusted in amber powder. You pass a sleeping cat curled beside a stack of papyrus scrolls, purring like the room remembers you. Maybe it does. At the final threshold, you pause. The door to the outside is slightly ajar, wind curling around its edge like a ribbon. You pull your cloak tighter, even though the air is warm. The scent of the manuscripts lingers on your sleeves, caught in your hair, embedded in the folds of your collar. It's there now. Yours, not stolen, just gifted. Like a story passed from hand to hand. You step out into the world again. The sun low. The sky turning that syrupy gold that only lasts 10 minutes, if that. A breeze brushes your cheek, and you swear for a second it smells of cinnamon and dust. Or maybe you just want it to. That's the thing with stories. They change the way you smell the world. And this one has changed you.